Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight we're settling in with a hormone that most people have heard of, but far fewer truly understand, and yet it has a hand in nearly every meal you eat, every rise and fall in energy you feel, and every frustrating moment when your body seems unwilling to let go of stored fat. That hormone is insulin. It does not stomp into the room with a dramatic cape. It does not make a great deal of noise about itself. It is more like a diligent little manager working behind the scenes, deciding where fuel should go, what should be stored, and what should wait its turn. And if you've ever felt like you were doing your best, eating less, trying harder, moving more, and still not seeing the changes you expected, then insulin may be one of the quiet reasons why. Before we ease into the story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your little corner of the evening. There is something strangely fitting about talking about metabolism and rest while so many of us are winding down, perhaps after dinner, perhaps after a long day of trying to be sensible with food, and somehow still ending up in a staring contest with the kitchen. If you find this soothing, helpful, or simply a gentle way to end the day, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm little space reach others who might need a softer way to learn. Now, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop a little, and let's begin with insulin, the quiet hormone behind every bite. Most people first hear about insulin in connection with diabetes, blood sugar, or perhaps a worried conversation at a doctor's office. It tends to arrive in public awareness wearing a medical name tag, but insulin is not some rare emergency hormone that only matters when something has gone wrong. It is a completely normal, necessary and very busy part of everyday human life. If you are alive, eating, thinking, moving, repairing tissue, and storing energy for later, insulin is involved. It is not a flaw in the system. It is part of the system. At its simplest, insulin is a hormone made by the pancreas. More specifically, it is produced by beta cells in little clusters of tissue called the islets of Langerhans, which sounds far grander than something involved in what happens after a sandwich. The pancreas sits behind the stomach, doing a great deal of important work without much appreciation. One of its jobs is to watch what is happening in your blood, especially the level of glucose moving through it. Glucose is one of the body's main fuels. It is especially important for certain tissues, including the brain, which is rather demanding for an organ that spends all day inside a dark bone helmet commenting on your decisions. When you eat food, especially food containing carbohydrates, your digestive system breaks much of it down into smaller components. Starches become sugars, complex structures are reduced into units the body can absorb, and eventually glucose begins to enter the bloodstream. This is where insulin becomes especially important. Your blood is not supposed to become a kind of sugary soup. Glucose needs to be moved, used, stored, and kept within a certain range. Too little is dangerous, too much is also dangerous. The body likes balance, and insulin is one of the tools it uses to maintain that balance. So insulin is released, not out of panic, but out of routine. It is responding to a signal that fuel has arrived. You can think of it as the body's way of saying, good, resources are here, let's deal with them properly. This is where many people get confused, because insulin has earned a reputation as the villain in fat loss discussions. It is often spoken about as if it were a tiny tyrant standing between you and the body you want, but insulin is not evil. It is doing what evolution designed it to do. It helps move nutrients into cells. It helps keep blood sugar from rising too high. It helps the body store energy for later. In a world where famine was more common than convenience stores, that was a brilliant arrangement. The trouble begins when a normal, useful hormone is asked to operate in an environment it was never really built for. Our ancestors did not live in a world of constant snacking, sweet drinks, giant desserts, breakfast cereal that behaves more like candy and polite packaging, and food engineered to be eaten quickly and craved repeatedly. They did not spend their days surrounded by easy calories, and their nights under stress, artificial light, sleep deprivation, and the sort of chronic exhaustion that makes a biscuit look like emotional support. Insulin developed in bodies that needed to survive scarcity, not in bodies navigating endless abundance. To understand why insulin becomes so important in fat loss, we need to begin with what it is trying to accomplish on an ordinary day. After a meal, insulin rises. Its basic message is that fuel is coming in, so the body should use what it can and store what it does not need immediately. Some glucose will be used right away for energy. Some will be stored as glycogen in the liver and muscles, which is a more convenient short-term storage form. And if there is more incoming energy than the body can use or store in those forms, some of that energy will eventually be directed toward fat storage. That last part is where many people become suspicious, understandably so. But the body is not trying to be unhelpful. Stored fat is not an act of betrayal. It is stored energy, a reserve, a backup, a biological savings account. If food becomes scarce later, those reserves can be called upon. That is exactly what fat tissue is for. It is not a moral failing. It is not evidence that your body hates you. It is a sign that your body takes survival seriously. The real issue is not that insulin stores energy sometimes. The real issue is what happens when insulin is elevated too often, too much, or in a system that has become less responsive to it. In that state, the body can begin to have a harder time accessing stored fat, even while continuing to store more. That is where the problem starts to feel deeply unfair. You may be carrying plenty of stored energy, and yet your body behaves as if it is reluctant to spend it. Rather like having money in a savings account, but every withdrawal requiring 6 forms, a password you have forgotten, and a polite rejection from the bank manager. Insulin's job is not only to help move glucose into cells, it also affects fat metabolism quite directly. When insulin is elevated, the body shifts away from burning stored fat and towards dealing with incoming fuel. That makes sense. If energy has just arrived, the body tends to use or store that first. Breaking down body fat becomes less urgent in that moment. This is not a problem when insulin rises and falls in a healthy rhythm. It is simply part of normal metabolism. Eat, store some, use some, then later, when insulin falls, tap into stored energy between meals or overnight. Healthy metabolism is flexible. It moves between feeding and fasting states. It stores when there is food. It releases when there is not. The trouble comes when a person spends much of the day in a state that resembles constant feeding. Not necessarily because they are eating enormous meals, but because they are eating frequently, choosing foods that drive strong insulin responses, and perhaps already living in a body that has become less sensitive to insulin over time. In that situation, the body may spend less time in the lower insulin state where stored fat is easily accessed. The doors to the pantry are not locked forever, but they are opened less willingly. This is one reason why some people feel trapped in a cycle. They eat, feel full briefly, then crash or grow hungry again. They crave quick energy. They snack to feel normal. Insulin rises again. Blood sugar is managed, but the cycle repeats. Over time, especially if tissues become less responsive to insulin, the pancreas may release even more of it to get the same job done. The hormone is working harder, speaking louder, and the body is gradually becoming more difficult to manage. Not because it is lazy, not because you are broken, but because chronic overexposure can make cells stop listening as efficiently. This is one of the roots of insulin resistance, and it is one of the reasons fat loss can feel mysteriously difficult. But before we get too far ahead, it helps to stay with the basics. Imagine you eat a meal of toast, juice, cereal, and perhaps something sweet on the side because mornings are hard and life is not always improved by restraint before 8 a.m. Those foods digest fairly quickly. Glucose enters the bloodstream, insulin rises, cells take in fuel, blood sugar is prevented from climbing too high. So far, all is proceeding according to plan. Now imagine that a few hours later, perhaps because breakfast was rapidly digested and not especially satisfying, You feel tired and hungry again. Maybe your concentration dips. Maybe you want another coffee and something crunchy or sweet. You eat again. Another insulin rise. Then lunch. Then an afternoon snack. Then dinner. Then perhaps something in the evening, because after all you've earned it, and the sofa has a way of encouraging nutritional diplomacy. By the end of the day, insulin has been summoned repeatedly, and the body has had relatively few long stretches in a lower insulin state. Again, one day of this is not a catastrophe. Human bodies are resilient. The issue is the pattern repeated over months and years. The body adapts to what happens often. If high insulin becomes common, it changes the metabolic climate. Cells may become less responsive. Fat burning may become less accessible. Hunger signals may become more confusing. Energy may feel less stable. And now the person is blamed for lacking discipline when, in many cases, their biology has simply been nudged into an unhelpful groove. This is why insulin is such a central topic in discussions of body fat. It is not because insulin alone decides everything. Total energy intake still matters. Activity still matters. Sleep, stress, genetics, food quality, muscle mass, medications, and many other factors matter too. Human metabolism is not a single-button machine, but insulin is one of the major traffic directors. It influences whether the body is more inclined to store or release energy. It influences how stable blood sugar feels. It influences appetite in indirect but powerful ways. Ignore insulin entirely, and the picture becomes incomplete. There is also a strange emotional dimension to all this. Many people quietly assume that if they cannot lose fat, they must simply be weak, indulgent, or doing something embarrassingly obvious wrong. They imagine that somewhere out there is a more disciplined person who could live in the same body and achieve effortless results. This is a very painful idea and unfortunately a very common one. But biology is not a character test. Hormones are not moral verdicts. A body shaped by years of certain eating patterns, stress, poor sleep and metabolic adaptation is not behaving badly. It is behaving according to the signals it has been given. Insulin, then, is part of a larger story about how the body protects itself. When it sees incoming energy, it helps manage that energy. When it sees repeated surges, it adapts. When cells become less responsive, the system compensates. When fat is frequently stored and less frequently released, the person experiences this not as elegant physiology, but as frustration. They feel hungry when they think they should not, tired when they think they should feel energized, stuck when they think they're trying hard enough. And because hormones operate invisibly, the whole thing feels personal. It feels as though one's body is refusing to cooperate out of spite, which would be dramatic and perhaps a little theatrical for an endocrine system, but not especially accurate. A more useful way to think about insulin is as a messenger. It carries a very practical message. Fuel is available, store and organize accordingly. If that message arrives occasionally and clearly, the body handles it well. If it arrives constantly, loudly, and in the setting of excess energy and reduced sensitivity, problems begin. Not overnight. Not with one dessert or one holiday or one difficult week. Gradually, quietly. Until one day a person notices that fat loss feels harder than it used to. Hunger feels harder to trust, and the body seems to prefer storing energy to spending it. This is where so many diets go wrong. They focus only on eating less, often in ways that leave insulin patterns, hunger, and food quality unchanged. A person may white-knuckle their way through smaller portions while still eating foods that spike and crash their appetite, still snacking frequently, still sleeping badly, still living in a body with significant insulin resistance. They are told that the problem is simple arithmetic. Then when the arithmetic does not seem to behave, they feel ashamed. But the body is not a calculator with legs. It is a dynamic hormonal system trying to keep you alive in a modern environment full of mixed signals and very persuasive pastries. All of this makes insulin worth understanding, not fearing. Fear is rarely useful in biology. curiosity is better. Insulin is not your enemy. It is a signal that became mismatched with a modern pattern of living. It is a helper that can become part of the problem when called upon too often and too forcefully. It is a normal hormone operating in abnormal circumstances, and once you begin to see it that way, the story of fat gain and fat loss becomes less about blame and more about conditions. That shift matters. Because when people believe the issue is entirely about willpower, they tend to fight themselves. They push harder, judge more, and often choose harsher methods. When they understand that insulin and other metabolic signals are involved, they can begin to work with the body instead. They can ask different questions. Not just, how do I eat less, but what makes me hungry again so quickly? Not just, why can't I stay disciplined? But, what pattern is keeping my energy unstable? Not just, why is my body storing fat? But, what signals is it receiving all day long? That is a far gentler and far more effective place to start. So tonight, as we settle into this topic, the important thing to carry with you is simple. Insulin is not an obscure hormone that only matters in illness. It is one of the central managers of energy in the human body. It rises when you eat. It helps move nutrients where they need to go. It encourages storage when energy is abundant. It makes fat burning less active when it is elevated, and when it remains high too often, or when the body becomes resistant to it, losing fat can become much harder than people expect. That does not mean hopeless. It does not mean permanent. It does not mean your body is defective. It means there is a system to understand, a pattern to notice, a quiet hormone behind every bite, every rise in blood sugar, every attempt the body makes to keep order in the midst of modern eating. And once you understand that quiet hormone a little better, the next question becomes even more interesting, because insulin never acts alone. It appears in response to something very ordinary, very daily, and very easy to overlook. It begins the moment food enters the picture, when the body first senses that a meal has arrived and starts deciding what should happen next. There is a moment so ordinary that it barely seems worth noticing, when a meal stops being food on a plate and becomes a full-body event. It happens before your fork has made many trips, before your stomach has had time to feel full, and well before any calorie has had a chance to become a walk, a thought, or an unfortunate extra biscuit around the waist. The body is faster than appetite, faster than satisfaction, and far faster than conscious awareness. The instant you begin to eat, systems wake up, messages start moving, organs begin coordinating, and a remarkable chain of events quietly unfolds. What feels like a simple bite of dinner is, in truth, the opening signal for one of the most carefully managed operations in human biology. This matters more than people often realize because the story of insulin does not begin when blood sugar has already risen dramatically or when body fat has already been stored. It begins with anticipation, detection, preparation, and response. The body does not wait passively for chaos and then rush in to fix it. It tries to get ahead of the problem. It sees food coming and begins organizing itself accordingly. In many ways, metabolism is less like a fire brigade and more like a very alert housekeeper who hears the guests arrive and starts laying out the plates before anyone even knocks. So let's slow it down and follow what happens step by step from the very first moment you eat. Before food is even swallowed, the body has already started reacting. Sight, smell, and taste matter. The aroma of warm bread, the sight of a sweet drink, the first taste of something rich or starchy, all of these can trigger what is called the cephalic phase response. This is an early preparatory reaction driven largely by the brain and nervous system. It is the body's way of saying, food is on the way, get ready. Saliva increases, digestive secretions begin to rise, the stomach prepares. The pancreas may even release a small amount of insulin before much glucose has entered the bloodstream at all. That last part often surprises people. We tend to imagine insulin as reacting only after sugar appears in the blood. But the body's more predictive than that. It learns patterns. It responds to expectation. If you regularly eat certain foods, your body becomes skilled at anticipating what is likely to come next. It is not reading your mind, thankfully, because that would be a dangerous amount of access for an organ system. But it is reading cues, taste, smell, chewing, and the arrival of nutrients in the gut all help shape the early hormonal response. Once you swallow, digestion begins in earnest. Some digestion has already started in the mouth, especially for carbohydrates. Saliva contains enzymes such as amylase, which begin breaking down starches into smaller sugars. This is not the complete breakdown, but it is an opening move. Food then travels down the esophagus and into the stomach, where it is churned and mixed with acid and digestive enzymes. Proteins begin to unravel and break apart. Fat is physically dispersed. Carbohydrates continue moving along their path towards smaller, absorbable forms. The stomach is not simply a bag where food sits like laundry in a machine. It is a muscular chamber that controls timing, mixing, and release. This matters because the speed at which food leaves the stomach influences how quickly nutrients reach the small intestine and then the bloodstream. A meal rich in refined carbohydrates and low in fiber or protein may move along relatively quickly. A meal containing more protein, fat, and fiber may slow the process, creating a gentler entry of nutrients into the circulation. This timing difference has enormous consequences for blood sugar, insulin, satiety, and later hunger. After the stomach, food enters the small intestine, and here the real absorption begins. Carbohydrates that have been broken down into glucose and other simple sugars can now cross into the bloodstream. Amino acids from proteins do the same. Components of fat are absorbed through a more complex path involving bile, micelles, and later transport through the lymphatic system. The details are intricate, but the general point is simple. The meal is no longer outside you. It is becoming you, or at least becoming available to your cells. As glucose begins to rise in the blood, the pancreas takes notice. This is one of its great specialties. Beta cells sense blood glucose and respond by releasing insulin. This is not an all-or-nothing switch. It is a carefully graded response. The amount of insulin released depends on the amount and type of food, the speed of absorption, the body's current sensitivity to insulin, and even previous meals. A body that is insulin sensitive may need only a modest rise in insulin to manage a meal well. A body that has become more insulin resistant may need to produce much more for the same result. But insulin is not working alone. The gut itself sends powerful hormonal signals during and after eating. Among the most important are incretins, such as GLP-1 and GIP. These hormones are released by the intestines in response to nutrients and help amplify insulin secretion when glucose is present. This is another example of the body's predictive intelligence. The gut tells the pancreas that food has arrived and that insulin will soon be needed. The body does not like being caught unprepared, especially around sugar. At the same time, the liver is receiving signals too. The liver is one of the central traffic managers of metabolism. It stores glucose as glycogen when plenty is available, releases glucose when levels are low, processes nutrients, and helps coordinate energy use across the body. When insulin rises after a meal, the liver reduces its own glucose output and increases storage. In simple terms, it stops sending extra sugar into the blood and starts putting some away for later. This helps prevent blood sugar from climbing too high. Muscle tissue also responds to insulin. In muscle cells, insulin helps move glucose transporters, especially GLUT4, to the cell surface. These transporters act like entry points, allowing glucose to move from the blood into the cell where it can be used for energy or stored as glycogen. Muscle is one of the major places where glucose can be cleared efficiently, which is one reason physical activity improves insulin sensitivity. A body with more active muscle tissue has more room to put incoming fuel to use. Fat tissue responds as well, though this part of the story tends to attract more suspicion. Insulin encourages fat cells to take in and store energy. It also suppresses the breakdown of stored fat, a process called lipolysis. This makes perfect sense in the context of a meal. If fuel is arriving right now, the body prefers to deal with that incoming fuel rather than simultaneously pulling large amounts of stored fuel out of adipose tissue. It is trying to avoid metabolic confusion. Imagine running a shop where delivery trucks keep arriving while employees are also dragging old inventory back out of storage and scattering it across the floor. The body prefers a calmer system than that. This is the key point that often gets lost in simplified diet talk. After you eat, insulin rises not because the body wants to sabotage your goals, but because it needs to organize the incoming nutrients. If glucose was simply left circulating in the blood without control, that would be harmful. The rise in insulin is not itself the mistake. It is the normal response. The problem emerges when this normal response becomes exaggerated, too frequent, or less effective over time. For example, a meal built around rapidly digested carbohydrates, especially in liquid or highly processed form, may lead to a sharp and quick rise in blood glucose. The pancreas responds with a strong insulin release. If the body is already somewhat insulin resistant, even more insulin may be needed. Blood glucose may then fall fairly quickly afterward, sometimes leaving the person tired, hungry, or craving more food. They may experience this not as a hormonal pattern, but as a completely reasonable thought, such as, "I need something sweet," or "Why am I hungry again already?" The biology underneath remains hidden, but it is shaping the experience powerfully. By contrast, a meal with slower digestion, more fibre, more protein, and a structure that does not flood the bloodstream with glucose all at once will often produce a smoother response. Blood sugar rises less sharply. Insulin still rises, but perhaps not as aggressively. Satiety may last longer. Energy may remain steadier. This is not magic. It is just a different metabolic choreography. Another important piece begins in the brain. Eating does not simply fill the stomach and send nutrients into the blood. It also interacts with appetite circuits, reward pathways, and learned expectations. Dopamine is involved in the anticipation and reward of food. Ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone, changes across the eating process. Leptin plays a longer-term role in energy balance. Signals from the gut travel via hormones and nerves, especially the vagus nerve, back to the brain to report on what has arrived. Was there protein? Was there volume? Was there energy? Was the stomach stretched? Are nutrients entering the intestine? Satiety is not one signal. It is a committee meeting, and like many committees, it reaches conclusions at different speeds. This delay matters a great deal. The brain does not instantly know that enough food has been eaten. Satiety signals take time to build. If someone eats very quickly, especially highly palatable, easy-to-chew foods, they may consume a large amount before the fullness signals have had much chance to catch up. By the time the body says, "That will do," the plate is empty, the dessert has somehow also vanished, and the meal has overshot the point of true need. This is not always a failure of self-control. It is often a mismatch between food design, eating speed, and the natural lag of biological feedback. The composition of the meal also affects what happens next. Protein stimulates insulin too, which surprises some people who imagine insulin responds only to carbohydrates. But protein also stimulates other hormones, including glucagon, and tends to support satiety well. Fat has a more modest immediate effect on insulin, but slows gastric emptying and can influence fullness. Carbohydrates vary greatly. A bowl of lentils does not behave like a sugary drink, even if both technically contain carbohydrate. Food structure, fiber content, processing, and meal context all matter. And then there is the issue of repeated exposure across the day. One meal produces one metabolic response. But humans do not eat in isolation. Breakfast influences lunch. Lunch influences dinner. Dinner influences the next morning's hunger and glucose control. Sleep the night before influences insulin sensitivity the next day. Stress hormones such as cortisol influence blood sugar and appetite. A sedentary day reduces muscle demand for glucose. A good walk after a meal improves disposal. The moment you eat is important, but it is always arriving in the context of what came before. Let us imagine an ordinary afternoon. Someone has had a quick breakfast, perhaps mostly refined carbohydrate, little protein, and eaten in a rush. Blood sugar rose, insulin rose, glucose was managed, but the meal did not keep them full for long. Mid-morning, they grabbed a snack. Another rise, another insulin response. Lunch was taken at a desk, perhaps a sandwich, crisps, and a drink. By mid-afternoon, energy dipped. A biscuit appeared, perhaps from a communal tin whose existence is always justified as harmless office morale. Another small wave of glucose, another pulse of insulin. None of these events is dramatic, yet each one contributes to the day's hormonal rhythm. If this pattern repeats every day, the body lives inside that rhythm. It adapts to it. Now imagine a different day. Breakfast includes eggs and yogurt, perhaps fruit, perhaps something slower and more satisfying. The meal is eaten with enough time to register. Blood sugar rises, but gently. Insulin responds, but not in a panic. Hunger stays away longer. Lunch is balanced. A walk happens afterward. Dinner is substantial enough to satisfy. The body still releases insulin, of course. That is what healthy bodies do. But the pattern is calmer. The metabolic terrain is different. The person may feel this simply as steadier energy and less obsession with snacks. Beneath that ordinary feeling lies a very different hormonal day. One of the reasons insulin can become such a problem in fat loss is that the moment you eat is not just about handling what came in. It is also about temporarily deciding what will not happen. When insulin's high, fat release is dialed down. The body is saying, use or store this incoming fuel first. That is fine in a healthy pattern where insulin rises and later falls. But when meals and snacks are frequent, or when the person is consuming foods that keep triggering a strong response, the body spends more of the day with fat mobilization turned down. Again, not permanently, but often enough to matter. This does not mean that a single meal high in carbohydrate instantly becomes body fat. Human metabolism is not that crude. The body burns some, stores some, shifts some, compensates later. But over time, repeated conditions shape outcomes. If meals repeatedly bring in more energy than needed, if insulin repeatedly signals storage, if hunger and crashes repeatedly drive more intake, and if the body becomes less responsive to insulin along the way, fat accumulation becomes much easier, and fat loss becomes more difficult. There is also something quietly remarkable about how the body distinguishes between immediate emergency and long-term pattern. A healthy body can handle celebration meals, holidays, the occasional indulgent breakfast that looks like it was designed by a committee of delighted children. The system is flexible. Problems arise not from the occasional feast, but from repeated metabolic strain without enough recovery. Chronic overfeeding, chronic snacking, chronic sleep loss, chronic inactivity, chronic stress. The body can absorb a lot of chaos, but it notices what is frequent. That is why it is so useful to understand the first spark of eating not as a moral event but as a biological event. The body does not ask whether a croissant was deserved. It asks what nutrients have arrived, how quickly they are entering the blood, what hormones should be released, where the energy should go, and what should be stored for later. Metabolism is practical. It is not judging. It is responding. This perspective can be oddly comforting. So many people approach eating with tension, guilt, or confusion. They wonder why some foods seem to wake up hunger rather than settle it. They wonder why they can eat one type of breakfast and think about food all morning, then eat another and feel fine until lunch. They wonder why they feel sleepy after some meals and clear-headed after others. These are not random quirks. They are clues about what the body is doing in response to the meal. They are the visible surface of hidden chemistry. The instant you eat, then, is not small at all. It is the opening move in a long chain involving the brain, stomach, intestines, pancreas, liver, muscles, fat tissue, blood vessels, nerves, hormones, and learned patterns of appetite. Food is sensed, broken down, absorbed and sorted. Insulin rises to keep order. Other hormones assist. Blood sugar is managed. Some fuel is burned, some is stored. Appetite is shaped for what comes next. Whether the result is stable energy and good satiety, or an early crash and renewed hunger, depends on the condition of the body and the nature of the meal. And this is why the story of insulin becomes so important so quickly. The moment you eat, the body is not merely counting calories, it is interpreting a signal. Is this a gentle arrival of nutrients or a flood? Is the body insulin sensitive or resistant? Are muscles ready to take up glucose or sitting idle? Is the liver already burdened? Are appetite signals calm or chaotic? These questions are being answered beneath awareness every time a meal begins. The first spark, in other words, is not just the start of digestion. It is the start of a hormonal decision about fuel, storage, and access. And once that spark has happened enough times in a certain pattern, another question begins to matter. If insulin keeps arriving to move glucose into cells, what exactly is supposed to happen to that sugar once it is in the blood, and why is the body so determined not to leave it floating there? There is something quietly remarkable about the way your body treats sugar, not as a harmless passenger drifting through the bloodstream, but as something that must be handled with care, moved quickly, and kept within a very narrow range. It is not that glucose is dangerous in itself. In fact, it is one of the most important fuels you have. Your brain depends on it. Your muscles use it. Your cells rely on it to produce the energy that keeps everything running, from your heartbeat to your ability to remember where you left your keys. And yet, for all its usefulness, glucose is not allowed to simply float freely in high amounts for very long. The body is almost fussy about it, adjusting, correcting, and responding with a kind of quiet urgency every time levels begin to rise. To understand why insulin matters so much in fat loss, it helps to understand why the body cares so deeply about blood sugar in the first place. Because insulin is not reacting to food randomly. It is responding to a problem the body is very keen to avoid, which is having too much glucose circulating in the blood for too long. The system is designed to keep things steady, not extreme. And that steadiness, that constant gentle correction, is one of the reasons your metabolism works as well as it does most of the time. When you eat, especially foods that contain carbohydrates, those carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and other simple sugars. These enter the bloodstream through the walls of the small intestine. At this point, glucose is not yet inside your cells where it can be used. It is in transit, moving through the bloodstream like a delivery waiting to be accepted. This is where the body becomes very attentive. Blood is not meant to be a storage site for large amounts of energy. It is more like a transport system, a road network carrying nutrients, oxygen, hormones, and signals from one place to another. If glucose levels rise too high, even temporarily, it begins to create problems. Not always immediately noticeable problems, but real ones nonetheless. High concentrations of glucose can interfere with normal cellular function, damage delicate tissues over time, and disrupt the balance of fluids and electrolytes. The body knows this, and it acts accordingly. One way to think about it is to imagine that glucose is useful fuel, but only when it is in the right place. Inside cells, it can be turned into energy. Floating around outside cells in large amounts, it becomes more like clutter, something that needs to be cleared away. The body does not like clutter, especially in something as critical as the bloodstream. So the moment glucose begins to rise, sensors in the pancreas detect the change. The beta cells respond by releasing insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin travels quickly, carrying a very specific message to tissues throughout the body. That message is simple but powerful. Take in glucose, use it, or store it. It is not a suggestion. It is a coordinated instruction aimed at restoring balance. Muscle cells are one of the primary destinations for this message. When insulin binds to receptors on muscle cells, it triggers a cascade of events inside the cell that ultimately leads to the movement of glucose transporters to the cell surface. These transporters, particularly GLUT4, act like doors that open to allow glucose inside. Once inside, glucose can be used for immediate energy or stored as glycogen for later use. This is one of the most efficient and beneficial uses of incoming glucose, especially when muscles are active and ready to use that fuel. The liver also plays a central role. It acts as a kind of buffer, smoothing out fluctuations in blood sugar. When glucose is high, the liver takes some of it in and stores it as glycogen. When glucose is low, the liver can release stored glucose back into the bloodstream to keep levels stable. Insulin influences this process by telling the liver to store rather than release. It is part of the overall effort to bring blood sugar down to a comfortable range. Fat cells respond as well. They can take in glucose and convert some of it into fat for long-term storage. Again, this is not a mistake. It is part of the body's design. When energy is plentiful, some of it is saved for times when it may not be. In a world where food was once unpredictable, this was a life-saving feature. In a world where food is constantly available, it can become part of the difficulty. The important point here is that the body cannot simply ignore elevated blood sugar and hope it resolves itself. It must act. And insulin is the primary tool it uses to do so. Without insulin, or with insulin that is not working effectively, glucose remains in the bloodstream longer than it should. This is what happens in conditions like uncontrolled diabetes, where blood sugar can remain chronically high. Over time, that leads to damage in blood vessels, nerves, eyes, kidneys, and other tissues. The body's urgency around controlling glucose is not an overreaction. It is a protective measure. But this protection comes with consequences when the system is stressed repeatedly. Every time blood sugar rises, insulin is called upon to lower it. If this happens occasionally, the system handles it well. If it happens constantly, especially with large and rapid spikes, the system begins to adapt. The pancreas may produce more insulin, cells may become less responsive to insulin signal, the balance becomes harder to maintain. This is where the story begins to connect more directly to fat loss. Because insulin's job is not only to lower blood sugar, it also influences how the body handles energy more broadly. When insulin is elevated, the body is in a state that favours storage over release. It is not an all-or-nothing switch, but it tilts the balance. Fat breakdown is reduced, fat storage is encouraged. This is a normal response in the context of a meal. But when meals and snacks are frequent, and when blood sugar is rising often, insulin spends more time elevated. The body spends more time in a storage-oriented state. To understand why this matters, consider what happens between meals. In a healthy pattern, after a meal is digested and blood sugar returns to baseline, insulin levels fall. This allows the body to begin accessing stored energy, including fat. This is part of metabolic flexibility. The body can switch between using incoming fuel and stored fuel depending on what is available. When insulin remains high for long periods, this switch becomes less effective. The body has a harder time accessing stored fat, even if there is plenty of it. This is one reason people can feel as though they have energy stored on their body but cannot easily use it. It is not that the energy is not there, it is that the signals controlling access to it are not favourable. Insulin is one of those signals. It is not the only one, but it is a major one. There is also the issue of how quickly blood sugar rises after a meal. Not all foods affect blood sugar in the same way. Highly refined carbohydrates, especially those low in fibre and combined with sugars, can lead to rapid increases in blood glucose. The body responds with a strong insulin release. Blood sugar may then fall relatively quickly, sometimes dropping below the level where the person feels comfortable. This can trigger hunger, fatigue, and cravings, leading to more eating and another cycle of rising and falling blood sugar. By contrast, foods that are digested more slowly that contain fibre, protein, and fat tend to produce a more gradual rise in blood sugar. Insulin still rises, but in a more controlled way. Blood sugar remains more stable. Hunger is delayed. Energy feels steadier. The difference is not just in calories, it is in the hormonal response. This is where many people begin to notice patterns in their own experience. A breakfast of sugary cereal and juice may lead to hunger by mid-morning. A breakfast with eggs, yogurt, or other protein-rich foods may last longer. A large portion of refined carbohydrates at lunch may lead to an afternoon slump. A more balanced meal may not. These are not just subjective impressions, they reflect underlying differences in how blood sugar and insulin are behaving. Another layer of complexity comes from insulin resistance. When cells become less responsive to insulin, the pancreas compensates by producing more of it. This can keep blood sugar within a normal range for a time, but at the cost of higher circulating insulin. The body is working harder to achieve the same result. This state can persist for years before blood sugar levels become obviously abnormal. During that time, insulin may be elevated more often, influencing fat storage and making fat loss more difficult. In this situation, a person may not have dramatically high blood sugar, at least not yet, but they may have chronically elevated insulin. This is sometimes referred to as hyperinsulinemia. It is less visible than high blood sugar, but can have significant effects on metabolism. It can promote fat storage, increase hunger, and make it harder for the body to access stored energy. It is important to note that none of this happens because the body is trying to make things difficult. It is responding to repeated signals. If blood sugar rises often, insulin is released often. If insulin is released often, cells may become less sensitive. If cells are less sensitive, more insulin is needed. The system adapts to the environment it's given. This brings us back to the original question. Why can't the body just leave glucose floating around in the blood? The answer is that it would be unsafe to do so. High blood sugar is not a neutral state. It interferes with normal function and, over time, causes damage. The body prioritizes keeping blood sugar within a tight range because that is essential for survival. Insulin is the primary tool for achieving that goal, but in solving one problem, the body can create another if the conditions are not ideal. By repeatedly lowering blood sugar through insulin, the body may also spend more time in a state that favors storage over release. This is not a flaw in insulin. It is a mismatch between a system designed for intermittent feeding and a lifestyle that often involves frequent high glycemic intake. There is also a subtle psychological component. Because the effects of blood sugar fluctuations are felt as hunger, fatigue, or cravings, people often interpret them as simple lack of willpower. They may not realize that a rapid rise and fall in blood sugar can create a very real drive to eat again. The body is trying to restore stability. The person experiences this as a desire for food. Without understanding the underlying biology, it is easy to misinterpret what is happening. This is why understanding blood sugar is so important in the broader story of fat loss. It is not just about how much you eat. It is about how your body responds to what you eat, how stable your blood sugar remains, how often insulin is elevated, and how easily your body can switch between storing and using energy. When blood sugar is kept within a stable range, insulin can do its job efficiently and then step back. The body can access stored energy between meals. Hunger signals are clearer. Energy levels are more consistent. When blood sugar is constantly rising and falling, insulin is called upon repeatedly, and the body spends less time in that lower insulin state where fat burning is more accessible. So the issue is not that glucose is bad. It is essential. The issue is that it must be handled carefully. The body cannot afford to leave it unmanaged in the bloodstream. Insulin is the system's way of maintaining order. But the way we eat, the types of food we choose, and the frequency of eating all influence how often and how strongly insulin is needed. Once you begin to see this, the role of insulin becomes clearer. It is not just reacting to food, it is managing a delicate balance, keeping blood sugar within safe limits, while also influencing how energy is stored and used. And if that balance is disrupted often enough, it can shape the body's tendency to hold on to fat. This leads naturally to the next step in the story, because once glucose is in the blood and insulin is released, the question becomes more specific. How exactly does insulin decide what happens next? How does it guide glucose into some cells, encourage storage in others, and influence whether energy is used immediately or set aside for later? There is a quiet moment after a meal when everything that has just been eaten begins to move through the body, not in a chaotic rush, but in an organized and deliberate way. Nutrients are arriving in the bloodstream, glucose levels are rising, and somewhere behind the stomach, the pancreas has already released insulin into circulation. At first glance, it might seem as though insulin simply lowers blood sugar and then steps aside, its job done. But that is only part of the story. Insulin is not just a responder, it is a decision maker. It helps determine where incoming energy goes, which tissues receive it first, how much is stored, and how much is used. In that sense, it behaves less like a simple signal and more like a gatekeeper, quietly deciding what is allowed in, what must wait, and what will be set aside. To understand this properly, it helps to imagine that your body is made up of many different rooms, each with its own needs and priorities. There are muscle cells that need fuel to move and work. There are liver cells that manage storage and release. There are fat cells that store long-term energy. And there are countless other tissues, each participating in the larger system. Glucose after a meal is like a delivery arriving at a complex building with many departments. Insulin is the one holding the master key, directing where the delivery should go. Without insulin, most cells cannot easily take in glucose. The glucose may be present in the blood, but it cannot enter the cells where it is needed. This is why insulin is often described as unlocking the door, but even that description is slightly too simple. It does not just open doors randomly. It opens them selectively based on signals, sensitivity, and the current state of the body. When insulin reaches a cell, it binds to a receptor on the cell surface. This receptor is not merely a passive latch, it is an active communication point. Once insulin attaches, it triggers a cascade of events inside the cell. Proteins are activated, signals are passed along, and eventually glucose transporters are moved to the cell membrane. These transporters act as entry points, allowing glucose to move from the bloodstream into the cell. In muscle cells, this process is particularly important. Muscles are one of the largest sites of glucose disposal in the body. When they are active, they can take in large amounts of glucose and use it for energy or store it as glycogen. When they are inactive, they are less eager to accept glucose, even if insulin is present. This is one reason why movement and exercise improve insulin sensitivity. Active muscles are more responsive. They are more willing to open their doors when insulin arrives. The liver behaves differently. It does not rely on insulin in quite the same way to take in glucose, but insulin strongly influences what the liver does with that glucose. When insulin levels are high, the liver shifts towards storage. It converts glucose into glycogen and reduces its own production of new glucose. It becomes a kind of storage depot, smoothing out fluctuations and keeping blood sugar from rising too high. Fat cells, or adipocytes, also respond to insulin, and this is where the gatekeeping role becomes more noticeable. Insulin encourages fat cells to take in energy and store it. It also inhibits the release of stored fat. In simple terms, when insulin is high, fat cells are more likely to store and less likely to release. This is not a flaw, it is a logical response to the presence of incoming fuel. If energy is arriving, the body prioritizes dealing with that energy first. But insulin's influence goes beyond simply moving glucose into cells. It also affects how nutrients are partitioned, meaning how the body decides what to do with the energy it receives. Should it be used immediately for energy, stored as glycogen, converted into fat? These decisions are influenced by many factors, including insulin levels, energy balance, activity level, and the current state of the body. For example, after a meal, if the body's immediate energy needs are low and glycogen stores are already full, excess glucose is more likely to be converted into fat. This process, known as de novo lipogenesis, is not the primary pathway for fat gain in most situations, but it becomes more relevant when there is a consistent surplus of carbohydrates and high insulin levels. More commonly, dietary fat is stored directly when insulin is elevated, because insulin reduces fat breakdown and allows stored fat to accumulate more easily. This is where the idea of insulin as a gatekeeper becomes particularly important for understanding fat loss. When insulin is elevated, it is not just allowing glucose into cells, it is also setting conditions that make fat storage easier and fat release more difficult. It is closing one door while opening another. It is important to emphasize that this is not a permanent state. Insulin levels rise and fall throughout the day. After a meal, insulin rises. As the meal is digested and glucose is used or stored, insulin falls. When insulin is low, the body is more able to access stored fat and use it for energy. This is part of the natural rhythm of metabolism. The body moves between feeding and fasting states, between storage and release. Problems arise when this rhythm is disrupted. If insulin remains elevated for long periods, either because of frequent eating, high intake of rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, or reduced insulin sensitivity, the body spends less time in the state where fat can be easily released. The gate remains partially closed. Energy is still being stored, but not as easily accessed. This can create a situation that feels deeply frustrating. A person may have significant fat stores, which represent stored energy, and yet the body behaves as though it is reluctant to use them. Hunger may persist, energy may fluctuate, fat loss may stall. From the outside, it may appear as though the person is simply eating too much or not trying hard enough. From the inside, it is a matter of hormonal signals and metabolic conditions. Another layer of complexity comes from insulin sensitivity. Not all cells respond to insulin equally. In a healthy, insulin-sensitive state, cells respond readily. A small amount of insulin is enough to move glucose into cells and restore balance. In an insulin-resistant state, cells become less responsive. The same amount of insulin produces a weaker effect. To compensate, the pancreas releases more insulin. This creates a situation where insulin levels are higher than normal, even if blood sugar is not dramatically elevated. The gatekeeper is shouting more loudly because the doors are not opening as easily. Over time, this can reinforce the conditions that favour fat storage. Higher insulin levels make it harder for fat cells to release stored energy. The body remains in a state that leans towards storage, even when it would be beneficial to shift toward release. It is also worth noting that insulin does not act in isolation. It interacts with other hormones, including glucagon, which has effects that often oppose insulin. While insulin promotes storage, glucagon promotes the release of stored energy. The balance between these hormones helps determine the overall metabolic state. When insulin is dominant, storage is favoured. When insulin is low and glucagon is relatively higher, release is favoured. Stress hormones such as cortisol also play a role. Cortisol can increase blood sugar and influence insulin sensitivity. Chronic stress can therefore complicate the picture, leading to higher blood sugar and increased insulin demand. Sleep too affects insulin sensitivity. Poor sleep can reduce the body's responsiveness to insulin, making it harder to manage blood sugar and increasing the likelihood of higher insulin levels. All of these factors influence how insulin behaves as a gatekeeper. It is not making decisions in a vacuum. It is responding to a complex environment shaped by diet, activity, sleep, stress, and individual biology. To bring this back to everyday experience, consider how different meals can feel. A meal that leads to steady energy, minimal cravings, and a long period before hunger returns is likely producing a different insulin response than a meal that leads to a rapid spike, followed by a crash and renewed hunger. The difference is not just in calories, it is in how insulin is managing the flow of energy into and out of cells. This is why focusing only on calorie intake can sometimes miss the full picture. Calories matter, but the hormonal context in which those calories are processed also matters. Two meals with the same calorie content can produce different insulin responses, different patterns of energy use and storage, and different effects on hunger and satiety. The gatekeeper analogy also helps explain why simply eating less does not always produce the expected results. If insulin remains elevated, the body may resist accessing stored fat, even when calorie intake is reduced. This can lead to increased hunger, reduced energy expenditure, and a sense of struggle. The body is not ignoring the reduced intake. It is responding to the hormonal signals it is receiving. This does not mean that insulin is the only factor in fat loss, nor that it overrides all others, but it does mean that insulin plays a significant role in shaping the conditions under which fat is stored or released. Understanding this role can help explain why some approaches to eating are more effective than others, even when calorie intake appears similar. It also highlights the importance of patterns rather than single events. One meal does not determine the outcome. It is the repeated pattern of meals, snacks, and lifestyle factors that shapes insulin levels over time. A pattern that allows insulin to rise and fall naturally, with periods of lower insulin between meals, supports the body's ability to access stored fat. A pattern that keeps insulin elevated most of the day makes that access more difficult. There is also a psychological benefit to understanding insulin in this way. It shifts the focus from blame to biology. It helps explain why certain patterns feel easier or harder to maintain. It provides a framework for making changes that work with the body rather than against it. Instead of thinking in terms of restriction alone, it becomes possible to think in terms of stability, timing, and composition. What kinds of meals produce a smoother response? How often is insulin being stimulated? Are there periods where the body can shift into a lower insulin state? These questions lead to practical changes that can improve metabolic health and make fat loss more achievable. At the same time, it is important not to oversimplify. Insulin is not a switch that turns fat loss on or off. It is part of a larger system, but it is a central part, and its role as a gatekeeper makes it especially influential. As we continue this journey, the picture becomes clearer. Glucose enters the bloodstream and must be managed. Insulin is released to guide that process. It opens doors for some tissues, directs storage in others, and influences whether energy is used or set aside. When this system works well, energy flows smoothly. When it becomes strained, the balance shifts and fat loss becomes more difficult. This leads to a deeper question, one that often sits at the center of frustration for many people. If insulin is guiding energy into storage and limiting the release of stored fat when it is elevated, what happens when insulin remains high for much of the day? How does that shape the body's tendency to store rather than burn? And why does it make fat loss feel like an uphill effort even when someone is trying to do everything right? One of the strangest and most frustrating things about the human body is that it can appear to make decisions you never consciously agreed to. You may think you're choosing moderation, effort, and restraint, and yet your body seems to be choosing storage. You may feel as though you're eating reasonably, moving more than before, trying to be careful, and still the scale barely moves. Or worse, moves in a direction you did not invite. It is very easy in those moments to feel betrayed by your own biology, as though somewhere inside you there is a stubborn accountant insisting on saving every possible calorie for an emergency that never arrives. And in a sense, that is not entirely wrong. The body is built to protect energy, preserve survival, and prepare for uncertainty. It does not share modern cosmetic goals. It is not especially interested in beach season. It is interested in not dying in a famine that your ancestors might realistically have faced. Even if your own greatest nutritional threat is the office biscuit tin and a supermarket aisle full of snacks that seem to have been designed by people who studied both flavor chemistry and emotional weakness. To understand why the body chooses fat storage even when you do not, it helps to step back from the language of dieting and look at the older logic underneath. Human metabolism did not evolve in a world where food was always available, where sugar could be delivered to your door, or where one bad mood could be soothed with a latte and a pastry before you had even finished deciding whether you were actually hungry. It evolved in a world where energy was precious, scarcity was common, and any body that could store excess energy efficiently had a better chance of surviving hard times. Fat in that world was not a cosmetic inconvenience, It was insurance. It was backup fuel. It was the body's quiet way of saying, we may need this later. That logic still lives in you. The body does not know whether the future shortage is a winter without food or simply a skipped lunch. It only knows that incoming energy should be handled wisely, and wisdom in biology often looks a lot like caution. Use what is needed now. Store what might be needed later. Repeat this pattern often enough, and storage grows. This is where insulin becomes such an important character in the story. After a meal, especially one containing carbohydrates, blood glucose rises. Insulin is released. Cells are encouraged to take up glucose. The liver stores some as glycogen. Muscles store some too if they have room and are receptive. But if there is more energy arriving than the body can use immediately, or store conveniently as glycogen, the remainder does not simply vanish because you meant well. The body shifts towards storage. Some of that storage is fat. Now, it is worth being careful here, because people often jump from that fact to a kind of dramatic conclusion that every carbohydrate instantly becomes body fat, and that one slice of bread is essentially a direct flight to adipose tissue. The body's more flexible than that. It is always juggling fuel sources, moving nutrients around, burning some, storing some, adjusting based on recent intake, activity, hormones, and overall energy balance. But the overall tendency is what matters. If insulin is elevated and energy is abundant, the body leans towards storage. If this pattern repeats day after day, fat accumulation becomes increasingly likely. The reason is not simply that insulin stores fat, it is that insulin changes the whole energy environment of the body. When insulin is elevated, the body becomes less interested in breaking down stored fat for fuel. It is dealing with incoming fuel first. It is directing traffic toward use and storage of what has just arrived. The release of stored fat from fat cells, a process called lipolysis, is reduced. In other words, when insulin is high, the body is more likely to be putting energy away and less likely to be taking energy back out. This makes excellent sense from a survival perspective. If you have just eaten, why would the body bother opening the long-term storage tank? The meal has already arrived. Use that first. Store what is left. Come back to the fat reserves later if needed. The problem, of course, is that in modern life later does not always arrive. Or rather, it arrives briefly and is interrupted by another snack, another meal, another sweetened drink, another handful of something eaten while standing in the kitchen, pretending it does not count because it never made it to a plate. So the body remains in this recurring pattern of incoming fuel and elevated insulin. It keeps dealing with what is arriving, it keeps closing the door on fat release, and gradually over time fat storage begins to outpace fat use. This is one of the reasons why someone can feel trapped in a body that seems to prefer storing energy even when they are making real efforts to eat less. The issue is not only the amount of food, it is also the hormonal environment in which that food is being processed. There is also a hierarchy to how the body handles fuel. Glucose in the blood must be managed quickly. It cannot be left floating around in high concentrations because that is harmful. So it gets priority. Glycogen storage is relatively limited. The liver and muscles can store only so much. Fat storage, by contrast, is spacious. Fat tissue is the body's expandable warehouse. If energy keeps arriving and immediate needs are already met, fat tissue is where much of the overflow can end up. It is efficient, compact, and metabolically useful for long-term storage. Again, from the body's perspective, this is a smart design, not a personal insult. The body's preference for fat storage also becomes stronger under certain modern conditions. One of the most important is insulin resistance. When cells become less responsive to insulin, the pancreas compensates by releasing more of it. This means that even when blood sugar looks fairly normal, insulin may be elevated more than it should be. The body is working harder to manage the same meal. More insulin means stronger signals towards storage and stronger suppression of fat release. The person experiences this not as an interesting endocrinology lecture, but as stubborn, fat, unpredictable hunger. and the maddening feeling that what used to work no longer does. Insulin resistance rarely appears out of nowhere. It tends to build slowly, encouraged by repeated overeating, inactivity, poor sleep, chronic stress, excess visceral fat, and constant exposure to foods that produce rapid spikes in blood sugar and insulin. This does not mean every overweight person is insulin resistant or every slim person is metabolically healthy. Human biology is more varied than that. But in many people, especially those struggling with abdominal fat and energy swings, insulin resistance is part of the story. Once this develops, the body can enter an especially frustrating cycle. Cells are less responsive to insulin, so the pancreas releases more. High insulin promotes fat storage and reduces fat release. Fat tissue grows, especially in metabolically active areas like the abdomen. Increased fat tissue, particularly visceral fat, contributes to inflammation and worsens insulin resistance. Now the body is even more likely to store energy and less able to access it. The system reinforces itself. From the outside, it can look like simple weight gain. From the inside, it is a hormonal loop. This is why the body may choose fat even when you do not. It is responding to the signals it is receiving, the sensitivity of the tissues, the pattern of meals, the availability of energy, and the long-term habits that shape metabolism. It is not listening to your conscious preference for fat loss, because conscious preference is not one of the hormones. Biology responds to chemistry, not to hopeful sighing in front of the mirror. Another important factor is that the body is not trying to maximize one single goal. It is not focused purely on body composition. It is balancing blood sugar, protecting organs, preserving fuel, managing hunger, maintaining body temperature, supporting reproduction when possible, responding to stress, and keeping you alive through all of it. If energy availability seems uncertain, even in a subtle way, the body may become more conservative. If dieting is aggressive, calories are slashed, and hunger rises, the body can respond by lowering energy expenditure, increasing appetite, and becoming more reluctant to release stored fat. This is one reason severe dieting so often backfires. The person feels they are forcing fat loss. The body feels it is entering a threat. When energy intake falls sharply, especially after long periods of overfeeding or repeated failed diets, the body may not simply say, "Wonderful, let us empty the fat stores immediately." It may say, "Something concerning is happening. We should save what we can." Hormones involved in hunger and fullness begin to shift. Leptin falls, hunger often rises, thyroid output may adjust, spontaneous movement may decline, the person may feel colder, more tired, more preoccupied with food, less able to resist cravings, and bewildered that the same calorie deficit that once produced quick results now produces mostly bad moods and a strong emotional bond with toast. This does not mean fat loss is impossible. It means the body's decision-making is more complicated than most diet slogans admit. The body chooses fat when the hormonal and energetic conditions favour fat. It chooses storage when fuel is abundant and insulin is high. It defends storage when it perceives shortage or stress. It becomes more likely to store when insulin resistance is present. It becomes harder to convince otherwise when sleep is poor, stress is chronic, and meals are built around foods that digest quickly and disappear from the bloodstream almost as quickly as they arrived. There is also the question of food quality and how it shapes appetite. Not all calories create the same level of satiety. A meal rich in protein, fibre, and minimally processed food tends to leave the body more satisfied and hormonally calmer than a meal built from refined flour, sugar, and industrially convenient ingredients engineered to be easy to eat and difficult to stop eating. The body may store fat more readily not only because of the direct insulin response to those foods, but because those foods often fail to satisfy for long. Hunger returns sooner, more food is eaten, insulin rises again. The pattern continues. This is why the debate between calories and hormones can become so tiresome. The truth is that both matter. Energy cannot be stored from nowhere. But hormones strongly influence whether you're hungry, whether your body is willing to release stored energy, and how incoming calories are handled. Telling someone that fat gain is only about calories can be technically neat, but biologically incomplete. Telling them it is only about insulin is also too simple. Human metabolism is an orchestra, not a kazoo. Insulin is one of the louder instruments, but not the only one. Still, if the specific question is why the body chooses fat, insulin deserves attention because it helps create the conditions in which fat storage is the easier option. Think of the body as always asking a quiet set of questions after a meal. Is there immediate energy to use? Is blood sugar rising? Are glycogen stores already full? Are tissues responsive? Are we in a fed state or a fasting state? Should we store this for later? When insulin is high and repeated often, the answers lean in a familiar direction. Use some, store the rest. Do not release much from the fat stores just now. We have plenty coming in. The tragedy, if one can call it that, is that many people live for years in a body that is being told this story every day. Breakfast says fuel is here. Snack says more is coming. Lunch repeats the message. Afternoon sugar confirms it. Dinner reinforces it. Evening nibbling adds emphasis. The body never gets long stretches of low insulin and clear access to stored fat. It remains perpetually half-fed, half-storing, never quite needing to draw deeply from reserves. Then the person attempts a diet, often by reducing portions but keeping much of the same food structure and frequency. Hunger rises, energy drops, fat loss stalls. They conclude that they lack discipline, when in reality the body is still receiving mixed metabolic instructions. Movement plays a role here too, because active muscles are metabolically expensive in the best possible way. They can soak up glucose, improve insulin sensitivity, and create a larger demand for energy that makes storage less automatic. A sedentary body with low muscle activity has fewer urgent reasons to use incoming fuel immediately. A physically active body creates more opportunities for energy to be burned rather than stored. This is not to say everyone must become an athlete. It simply means that the body's choices depend in part on how often it is given a reason to spend rather than save. Sleep is another powerful influence. Even one short night of poor sleep can reduce insulin sensitivity and alter hunger hormones. People often become hungrier, crave quick energy, and manage blood sugar less effectively after inadequate sleep. Chronic poor sleep makes the whole system tilt towards storage. Stress compounds this. Cortisol raises blood sugar, influences appetite, and can encourage abdominal fat storage over time. A body that is stressed, underslept, and overfed is much more likely to behave like a body under metabolic siege than a body ready to shed reserves calmly. All of this may sound rather unfair, and to be honest, it often is. Biology is not a meritocracy. People do not all start with the same insulin sensitivity, the same appetite regulation, the same relationship with food, or the same hormonal landscape. Some can get away with habits that quickly punish others. Some remain lean while eating in ways that would rapidly expand someone else's waistline. Genetics, early life, muscle mass, stress exposure, sleep, medications, and age all influence the game. But regardless of starting point, the same broad principles still operate. The body stores fat when the metabolic signals favour storage. It releases fat when the signals favour access and use. So when we say the body chooses fat even when you do not, what we really mean is that the body is responding to signals more ancient and more immediate than conscious intention. Your intentions matter because they shape behaviour. But behaviour shapes biology only through patterns repeated often enough to matter. One healthy meal does not undo months of high insulin and low activity. One dessert does not doom you either. The body watches the trend. It responds to rhythm. This is why fat loss becomes much more possible when people stop treating their body like an enemy to be starved into submission and start treating it like a system to be guided. Meals that produce steadier blood sugar, less frequent eating when appropriate, more protein and fibre, better sleep, more movement, especially after meals, less reliance on foods that trigger rapid spikes and crashes. These are not glamorous solutions, which is unfortunate because human beings do enjoy a glamorous solution, but they change the hormonal environment in which the body is making its choices. They make it easier for insulin to rise and fall appropriately. They create longer windows where fat can be accessed. They reduce the constant message that more storage is needed. And perhaps most importantly, they reduce the sense of personal failure. Because once you understand that your body is not randomly choosing fat out of spite, you can begin to see the pattern more clearly. The body stores because it is protecting. It stores because insulin is elevated. It stores because the immediate fuel keeps arriving. It stores because the environment, both internal and external, keeps pointing toward caution. What looks like sabotage is usually just physiology without context. The deeper irony is that a body with more fat on it may still behave as though usable energy is hard to come by. That seems absurd at first, like sitting on a full pantry while complaining there is nothing to eat. But if insulin remains high and the pathways to fat release remain partly closed, that is exactly what can happen. Energy is present, but not easily available. The person feels hungry not because the body has no reserves, but because it is not accessing them well. And that is where the next part of the story becomes crucial, because once the body starts storing more readily and releasing less easily, a more serious problem begins to appear. The cells themselves start to stop listening properly. The message of insulin gets louder, but the response grows weaker, and the whole metabolic system begins to shift into something more stubborn and more difficult to reverse. There comes a point in the story of insulin where the problem is no longer just that the hormone rises after meals, or that the body stores a bit too eagerly. The problem becomes something quieter and more stubborn. The message is still being sent, but the cells are no longer responding the way they once did. Insulin arrives, binds, signals, and asks for glucose to be taken in, but the answer from the tissues is slower, weaker, less cooperative. The doors are not completely shut, at least not at first, but they no longer open with the same ease. This is insulin resistance, and it is one of the most important reasons fat loss can begin to feel strangely difficult, as though the body has become a house where the keys still exist but half the locks have become temperamental. At the beginning, insulin usually works quite well. A meal is eaten, blood glucose rises, insulin is released, and cells respond. Muscle takes in glucose, the liver stores some, blood sugar settles. Fat cells do their usual work. The whole system is flexible and efficient. Insulin does not need to shout. A modest amount is enough to get the job done. This is what healthy insulin sensitivity looks like. The body hears the message clearly and acts on it. Insulin resistance begins when that clarity starts to fade. The pancreas still releases insulin, but tissues, especially muscle, liver, and fat tissue, become less responsive to its signal. The body has not become entirely deaf, but it has become harder of hearing. What once required a gentle knock now requires pounding on the door. To compensate, the pancreas releases more insulin. For a while, this works. Blood sugar may stay in a normal range because insulin levels are higher than they used to be. The outside world may see normal lab work and assume everything is fine. But internally, the system is already under strain. This is one of the most deceptive aspects of insulin resistance. It can develop quietly for years before blood sugar becomes obviously abnormal. During that time, insulin may be chronically elevated, hunger may be less stable, fat storage may be favoured, and energy may feel inconsistent. The person often has no idea that the underlying issue is not simply metabolism getting slower in some vague way, but a hormone trying harder and harder to make resistant tissues respond. It helps to look more closely at what insulin is actually asking cells to do. In muscle cells, insulin promotes the movement of GLUT4 transporters to the cell surface so glucose can enter. In the liver, Insulin suppresses glucose production and promotes storage. In fat cells, it supports energy storage and restrains fat release. These effects depend on functioning insulin receptors and intact signaling pathways inside the cell. When insulin resistance develops, something in this chain becomes less efficient. The receptor may not signal as well. The downstream pathways may be disrupted. The transporters may not move appropriately. The result is the same. Glucose is not handled as effectively. Why does this happen? There is no single cause, and that is part of what makes the condition so common and so frustrating. Insulin resistance is shaped by repeated excess energy intake, especially when paired with inactivity, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, genetic predisposition, and increasing body fat, especially around the abdomen. It is also influenced by inflammation, lipid accumulation inside tissues, hormonal environment, and the general metabolic wear and tear of modern living. It is not caused by one slice of cake or one lazy weekend. It is a gradual adaptation to repeated conditions. One of the biggest contributors is carrying excess energy in places it does not belong. Fat tissue is the body's normal storage depot, but when energy intake is repeatedly high and fat tissue becomes overfilled, fat can start accumulating in tissues such as the liver and muscle. This is not the same as the visible fat under the skin. It is fat inside organs and cells where it interferes with normal signaling. In the liver, this can lead to fatty liver. In muscle, it can disrupt the machinery that allows insulin to do its job. The cells do not become resistant because they are morally opposed to glucose. They become resistant because their internal environment is cluttered, inflamed, and less responsive. Inflammation plays a role too. Excess fat tissue, especially visceral fat around the organs, is metabolically active. It releases inflammatory signals and interacts with the immune system. Chronic low-grade inflammation interferes with insulin signaling. It is not the dramatic inflammation of an injury or infection. It is quieter than that, more like a background hum of irritation in the body's tissues. Over time, that hum matters. Inactivity is another major factor. Muscle is one of the most important places for glucose disposal. When muscles are regularly used, they become better at taking up glucose and more sensitive to insulin. They also store more glycogen and create a greater demand for fuel. But when muscles are underused, sitting quietly through long days and being asked to do little more than carry the body from one chair to another, their metabolic helpfulness declines. They become less eager participants in glucose management. A sedentary life makes insulin's job harder. Sleep deprivation is surprisingly potent here as well. Even a short period of poor sleep can reduce insulin sensitivity. After inadequate sleep, the body often handles glucose less effectively. Appetite regulation worsens, and cravings for quick energy increase. This is one reason a tired body often behaves like a body preparing for difficulty. It becomes more conservative, more hungry, and less metabolically graceful. Chronic poor sleep makes the whole system more resistant. Stress contributes through hormones such as cortisol, which can raise blood glucose and alter insulin action. This is especially relevant in modern life, where stress often arrives not in the form of a brief physical threat, but as persistent psychological pressure. Deadlines, worries, poor rest, emotional strain, financial concerns, and endless stimulation create a physiological state that can nudge the body toward higher glucose, higher insulin, and eventually greater resistance. Genetics also matter. Some people are simply more vulnerable to insulin resistance than others. They may develop it at lower body weights, younger ages, or with less obvious overeating. Others can gain weight and remain relatively insulin sensitive for a long time. This variation is one reason simple judgment is so unhelpful. Two people can live similarly and have quite different metabolic outcomes. Biology is not operating from a fair universal template. As insulin resistance develops, the pancreas responds by making more insulin. This stage is sometimes called compensatory hyperinsulinemia. The body is still keeping blood sugar under decent control, but it is paying a higher hormonal price to do it. The pancreas is working overtime, More insulin is circulating after meals, and often between meals as well. This matters enormously for fat loss because high insulin does not merely manage glucose, it also suppresses lipolysis, the release of stored fat. In practical terms, the body becomes more likely to store and less likely to access. This is one of the most painful parts of the condition. A person may have abundant stored energy on their body, and yet feel hungry, tired, and driven to eat more. That seems irrational until you remember that stored energy is only useful if the body is willing and able to release it. If insulin remains elevated, that release is impaired, so the person may be carrying thousands of calories of stored energy and still feel as though they need a snack to function. The body is not lying, it is simply not accessing reserves efficiently. This can create a miserable cycle. Frequent hunger leads to frequent eating. Frequent eating leads to repeated insulin release. Repeated insulin release, especially in an already resistant body, means even more insulin is needed. Fat remains hard to access. Weight may rise further. More visceral fat worsens inflammation and resistance. Meanwhile, the person is told to just eat less, as though the biological pressure to eat has not changed at all. It is a bit like telling someone to save money while quietly lowering their income and increasing all their bills. The liver behaves differently in insulin resistance, and this is important. In a healthy state, insulin tells the liver to reduce glucose output. But in an insulin-resistant liver, that message becomes weaker. The liver may continue releasing glucose into the bloodstream even when it should be settling down after a meal. This contributes to higher blood sugar and more demand for insulin. So now the pancreas must release even more insulin, not only because muscles are less responsive, but because the liver is also behaving unhelpfully. Fat cells can become insulin resistant too, but interestingly, not all tissues become resistant in exactly the same way or at the same rate. This creates odd metabolic situations where some of insulin's actions still work well while others do not. For example, insulin may be less effective at getting muscle to take in glucose, yet still quite effective at promoting fat storage and restraining fat release. The result is particularly frustrating. The helpful actions are weakened, while the storage-promoting actions remain strong enough to keep the person stuck. This uneven resistance helps explain why insulin resistance is so metabolically messy. It is not a neat on-off switch. It is a partial breakdown in communication across several tissues, each responding a little differently. The body compensates as best it can, but the compensation itself creates new problems. At first, the pancreas may keep up. It produces enough extra insulin to overcome the resistance. Blood sugar stays close to normal. But this cannot always continue forever. Over time, the beta cells of the pancreas may begin to struggle. They have been asked to work harder for years. Eventually, they may no longer produce enough insulin to compensate fully. At that point, blood sugar begins to rise more noticeably, and the person may move from insulin resistance into prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. But long before that diagnosis appears, the metabolic difficulties often have already been shaping body weight, appetite, and energy. That is why it is useful to see insulin resistance as a continuum, not a sudden event. A person does not wake up one morning transformed from metabolically healthy to resistant overnight. The process is gradual. Waistline slowly expands. Energy becomes less stable. Hunger becomes less trustworthy. Meals that once held someone for hours now barely last. Fat loss becomes harder. Lab values may drift. Eventually a doctor mentions glucose, A1C, or insulin. But the body has been whispering about the problem for some time. There are outward signs that often travel with insulin resistance, though none are perfect on their own. Persistent abdominal fat is common. Skin tags sometimes appear. Acanthosis, nigricans, dark velvety skin patches, often around the neck or underarms, can be a sign of high insulin. Afternoon crashes, intense cravings, difficulty going long between meals, and persistent hunger. Despite having body fat reserves are also common experiences. Women may see links with polycystic ovary syndrome, which often overlaps with insulin resistance. Men may notice increasing abdominal weight and declining metabolic flexibility. Again, these are patterns, not destiny, but they are clues. The phrase "cells stop listening" is useful because it captures the feel of the problem, but it can sound almost as though cells have developed a bad attitude. In reality, this reduced responsiveness may begin as a protective adaptation. If a cell is constantly flooded with fuel, exposed to high insulin, and cluttered with excess nutrients, becoming less responsive may be a way of limiting additional overload. From the cell's perspective, resistance may be less rebellion and more self-defense. Unfortunately, what protects the individual cell can make life much harder for the whole body. This idea changes the tone of the story. Instead of imagining insulin resistance as a mysterious defect or a sign of personal failure, it becomes easier to see it as the body adapting poorly to chronic conditions. Too much fuel, too little movement, too much stress, too little sleep, too much repetition of the same disruptive pattern. The body does not intend to sabotage itself. It is improvising under pressure. Fat loss in this context becomes difficult not because calories have stopped mattering, but because the hormonal terrain has changed. Higher insulin makes stored fat less available. Greater hunger makes reduced intake harder to sustain. Lower energy and more fatigue may reduce spontaneous movement. The person often feels as though every part of the system is quietly resisting them, which in a sense it is. The system has been nudged into a defensive state. This is why strategies that work beautifully in a metabolically flexible person may work poorly in someone with insulin resistance. A modest calorie reduction may be enough for one person to lose fat comfortably. Another person, more resistant, may feel ravenous, sluggish, and stalled on the same plan. The difference is not always effort. Often it is biology. One body hears insulin clearly and handles glucose easily. The other requires much louder signaling and remains more locked into storage. The good news, and it is genuinely good, is that insulin resistance is often improvable. Not always instantly, not always completely, and not without consistent change. But the locked doors are not usually welded shut forever. Muscle becomes more sensitive with movement, especially resistance training and walking. Liver fat can fall when energy intake improves and food quality changes. Sleep helps, stress management helps. Weight loss itself often improves insulin sensitivity, even though insulin resistance made the weight loss difficult in the first place. Protein-rich meals, fewer ultra-processed foods, longer gaps between meals when appropriate, better blood sugar stability, all can gradually reduce the pressure on the system. But improvement begins with understanding. If a person believes they are simply weak, they are likely to choose punishment. If they understand that the cells have become less responsive and the body is compensating hormonally, they can choose strategies that actually help. Instead of fighting hunger through sheer force every day, they can create meals that calm it. Instead of assuming more cardio will solve everything, they can build muscle and improve glucose disposal. Instead of grazing all day, they can allow insulin to fall between meals. Instead of treating sleep like an optional luxury, they can start seeing it as metabolic repair. This matters because insulin resistance often makes people distrust their own body. They feel hungry when the world says they should not. They gain easily when others seem carefree. They diet and regain. They come to believe something is uniquely wrong with them. But what is wrong is usually not mysterious. The doors have become harder to open. The signal has become less effective. The pancreas has been working too hard. The body has adapted to a difficult pattern and is now stuck in it. That is why this stage in the story is so important. Before insulin resistance, the problem may mostly be about repeated storage. After resistance begins, the system itself is less responsive. The body must use more insulin for the same tasks. Fat loss becomes harder, hunger becomes more pressing, and the whole rhythm of metabolism becomes less flexible. The person may be eating into a body that feels always full in one sense and never well fueled in another, And once that happens, another frustrating symptom often emerges. It is not just that stored fat is harder to access. It is that the body can start to feel as though it is never truly in a fat-burning state at all, always somewhat fed, always somewhat storing, always hanging on. That feeling of being metabolically stuck is where the next part of the story begins, because when insulin stays high enough, and often enough, the body can remain in a state that is always full, yet strangely reluctant to burn what it already has. A body can be carrying a great deal of stored energy and still behave as though it is hesitant to use any of it. That is one of the strangest things about metabolism, and one of the most maddening for anyone trying to lose fat. From the outside, it looks simple enough. There is energy stored in fat tissue, so surely the body should be able to draw from it when food intake is reduced. But inside the hormonal reality of the body, it is not always that straightforward. A body can be well stocked and yet metabolically cautious. It can be full in the sense of storage, yet not especially willing to burn what it has stored. And one of the main reasons for that is insulin staying too high for too long. This is the point where many people begin to feel that their body is somehow working against them. They cut back on food, or at least think they have. They try to be more careful. They skip dessert more often, take more walks, and perhaps even start buying impressively virtuous groceries that seem to promise immediate transformation the moment they enter the fridge. And yet fat loss is slow, inconsistent, or absent. The body may even respond with more hunger, more cravings, less energy, and the sort of moody resistance that makes a person stare at a rice cake as though it has personally betrayed them. It can feel deeply unfair because in one sense it is. There is energy there. The body is carrying reserves. Why is it behaving like it cannot spend them? The answer lies in how insulin shapes the body's access to stored fuel. Insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone, though that is often how it is introduced. It is a fuel-handling hormone. It helps direct what happens when energy enters the body, and one of its major effects is to reduce the release of stored fat while it is elevated. That makes sense after a meal. If new fuel is arriving, the body prefers to work with that fuel first. It does not need to open the long-term storage tank when the kitchen delivery has just arrived at the front door. But if insulin remains elevated much of the time, the body spends less time in the state where it can easily access fat stores. That is where fat loss begins to slow, and for some people, nearly stall. To understand why this feels like always full, never burning, it helps to think in terms of states. The body is constantly moving between a fed state and a fasting state. In the fed state, food has recently come in, blood glucose is rising or recently rose, insulin is elevated, nutrients are being sorted, stored and used. In the fasting state, food has not arrived for some time. Insulin falls. Stored glycogen may begin to be used. Stored fat becomes easier to mobilize. The body starts running more on reserves. Healthy metabolism is flexible partly because it can move between these states smoothly. The trouble comes when someone spends most of their waking day in a semi-fed state. Breakfast arrives, then coffee with milk and sugar, then a snack, then lunch, then something in the afternoon, then dinner, then perhaps a treat in the evening because it has been a long day. And frankly, the day has made a very strong case for chocolate. None of these events is a moral crisis. The problem is the pattern. Every time food is consumed, particularly food that raises blood glucose significantly, insulin rises. If meals and snacks are frequent enough, insulin never has much time to settle down. The body remains in a kind of low-level storage mode for much of the day. Now add insulin resistance to that pattern. Cells are responding less well, so the pancreas releases more insulin than it once needed to. This means the fed state is not only frequent but hormonally louder. More insulin is circulating, more suppression of fat release is happening, more of the body's attention is fixed on handling incoming fuel rather than drawing on stored fuel. The person may not be overeating dramatically in that moment. They may simply be living in a body that is hormonally structured to defend storage. This is where hunger becomes especially confusing. People often assume that if the body has plenty of stored fat, hunger should be minimal. Surely a well-stocked system can calmly draw on reserves and carry on. But hunger is not determined simply by how much fat a person has. It is influenced by what the body can access right now. If insulin is elevated and lipolysis is being suppressed, then stored fat is not easily entering circulation to be burned. The body may, in effect, behave as though energy availability is lower than total energy storage would suggest. This creates the odd situation where a person is carrying a significant amount of energy on their body, but still feels driven to eat because the body is not making that stored energy easily available. This is not a contradiction once you understand the signal. Fat on the body is like money in a savings account. Hunger depends more on what is in the wallet. If insulin is keeping the savings account hard to access, the body may act as though it needs a fresh deposit, even while it is technically wealthy in stored fuel. That is why someone can feel hungry, shaky, foggy, or deeply interested in biscuits despite having plenty of body fat. It is not because the fat does not exist. It is because the metabolic conditions for using it are poor. When insulin stays high, several things happen at once. Glucose handling remains the priority. The liver is encouraged to keep storing and not releasing as much. Muscle may still be taking in some fuel depending on activity and sensitivity. Fat cells are encouraged to keep energy in storage. The breakdown of triglycerides inside fat tissue into free fatty acids is reduced. This is the suppression of lipolysis, and it is one of the central reasons the body struggles to shift into effective fat burning when insulin remains elevated. For a metabolically healthy person, this suppression is temporary and appropriate. Eat a meal, insulin rises, fat release pauses, fuel is sorted, insulin falls later, and fat release resumes between meals or overnight. But in a person with chronically elevated insulin, especially one who snacks often, sleeps poorly, and has some insulin resistance that later may not arrive often enough to matter, the body gets only brief and shallow dips into the lower insulin state. Fat burning becomes less of a daily rhythm and more of an occasional technicality. This is one reason some people find that despite eating what they think is not very much, they feel tired and cold and preoccupied with food rather than energetically shedding fat. Their body is not smoothly switching into reserve mode. Instead, it is in a hormonal limbo. Insulin is still high enough to restrain fat release, but food intake may not be high enough to feel satisfying and abundant. So the person experiences the worst of both worlds. They are not eating enough to feel relaxed and energized, and they are not accessing stored energy well enough to make up the difference. It is a miserable place to be. This also helps explain why some weight loss efforts feel sustainable at first and then suddenly become harder. Early on, if someone reduces obvious excesses, eats a bit less, and moves more, they may see progress because insulin begins to settle somewhat, and the body starts to use stored energy more effectively. But if the person then continues with a food pattern that still keeps insulin fairly high, or if they reduce calories in a way that increases hunger without improving metabolic flexibility, progress can slow. The body becomes more cautious. Energy expenditure may drift downward. Spontaneous movement may decrease. Hunger becomes louder. Fat loss slows not because the laws of physics stopped working, but because the body's hormonal and behavioral adaptations are shifting against the deficit. Insulin is not acting alone in this. Leptin, ghrelin, cortisol, thyroid hormones, and nervous system activity all contribute. But insulin is one of the clearest links between meal pattern and fuel accessibility. When it stays high, the body does not feel much pressure to dip into long-term reserves. It remains focused on the fed state. And because the fed state is associated with storage and reduced fat release, fat loss becomes less efficient. There is another subtle issue. Chronically high insulin often travels with unstable blood sugar. Meals high in refined carbohydrates may send glucose up quickly, prompting a strong insulin response. Blood sugar then falls. Sometimes it falls into a perfectly normal range but feels low relative to the earlier peak, which can still trigger hunger and cravings. The person experiences this not as a graph on a lab report, but as an urgent desire for something sweet, starchy, or comforting. They may interpret that urge as weakness. In reality, it is often the downstream effect of a body swinging between fuel handling states badly. So now the person eats again, not because they are incapable of restraint, but because their physiology has made another meal or snack feel unusually important. Insulin rises again. Fat release is suppressed again. The body remains always somewhat full, never fully burning. This is why food quality and meal structure matter so much. A meal that digests quickly and causes a steep insulin response may set up the next hunger episode. A meal with more protein, fiber, volume, and slower digestion may calm the whole rhythm. It is not just about calories in a mathematical sense. It is about whether the body is being driven repeatedly back into a high insulin, low access state. There is also the issue of glycogen, the storage form of carbohydrate in the liver and muscles. Glycogen is a shorter-term storage system than fat. It is useful, limited, and relatively easy to fill in modern eating patterns. If glycogen stores are frequently topped up, and the body is not using much of them through movement or exercise, incoming fuel has fewer immediate productive destinations. Fat storage becomes more likely. Meanwhile, if insulin stays elevated, fat remains less available as a fallback, so the body keeps topping up its short-term stores, spilling more into long-term storage, and rarely needing to dip deeply into those long-term reserves. Physical activity can interrupt this pattern in helpful ways. Muscle contractions allow glucose uptake through mechanisms that are partly independent of insulin. In other words, moving your muscles helps pull glucose out of the blood and into the tissues even when insulin sensitivity is not ideal. This lowers the insulin burden, improves glycogen turnover, and makes the body more metabolically flexible. A person who walks after meals, lifts weights regularly, or simply breaks up long sedentary stretches gives their body more opportunities to use incoming fuel rather than store it. They also create more opportunities for insulin to fall later, because some of the nutrient burden has been put to immediate use. But many people who struggle with fat loss are not only insulin resistant, they are also tired. And they are tired not merely in the poetic sense of being weary of modern life, but in the physiological sense of having unstable blood sugar, poor sleep, chronic stress, and low-quality fuel handling. A tired body moves less, not necessarily because of laziness, but because movement feels more expensive. That lower movement further reduces insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal. Again, the cycle reinforces itself. Poor sleep deserves special attention here because it is one of the quickest ways to make a body behave as though it should store rather than burn. After a poor night of sleep, insulin sensitivity drops, hunger often rises, cravings increase, and stress hormones shift. The body behaves as though it expects hardship, and therefore needs more incoming energy. If this becomes chronic, the whole hormonal environment leans away from easy fat loss. The person may think they have a willpower problem when in fact they have a sleep problem wearing a willpower costume. Stress does something similar. Cortisol can raise blood glucose, increase appetite, and encourage the sort of fast, rewarding eating patterns that produce repeated insulin surges. Chronic stress also makes rest worse, decision-making harder, and exercise less likely. So the stressed person often ends up eating in a way that keeps insulin high, sleeping in a way that worsens insulin resistance, and living in a body that feels less and less willing to burn what it has stored. It is difficult to overstate how much the body's fuel choices are shaped by these background conditions. One of the more painful parts of this experience is that it often leads people into stricter and stricter dieting without fixing the underlying pattern. They cut calories harder. They skip meals in a chaotic rather than strategic way. They endure hunger through the day only to overeat at night. They choose low-fat, high-sugar diet foods that leave them hungry again an hour later. They exercise in ways that exhaust them, but do little to improve insulin sensitivity or preserve muscle. Then they blame themselves when they cannot maintain the plan. But a body with chronically high insulin does not respond well to sheer punishment. It responds better to conditions that improve sensitivity, stabilize intake, and create enough time at lower insulin levels for stored fat to become available. This is why some people notice a dramatic difference when they move from a pattern of grazing on processed carbohydrates to a pattern of more substantial, protein-rich meals with fewer eating occasions. They are not merely reducing calories by accident, though that often happens. They are reducing the number of insulin spikes, improving satiety, and allowing the body longer periods in which insulin can come down. In those lower insulin periods, lipolysis becomes easier. The body begins to access stored fat more willingly. Hunger often calms because energy availability is smoother. What the person experiences is not a miracle, but a restoration of metabolic rhythm. Likewise, adding resistance training can change the picture significantly, because muscle is such an important site for glucose disposal. Better muscle mass and more active muscle tissue make the body less reliant on high insulin to handle meals. This lowers the overall hormonal burden and improves the odds that insulin will rise appropriately and then fall again. More of the day becomes available for fat mobilization. The body becomes less always full and more willing to burn. There is no neat threshold where insulin suddenly becomes too high and fat loss stops entirely. Biology is rarely that theatrical. It is more of a gradient. The higher and more persistent insulin is, especially relative to the person's sensitivity, the more the body leans away from fat release. Some people are only mildly affected. Others are deeply stuck in this pattern and feel it in every meal and every attempt to diet. The principle remains the same. Fat loss slows when the hormonal signal consistently says store, manage, hold, and rarely says release, use, spend. This should also make clear why the phrase eat less and move more, while not entirely wrong, is often too crude to help. If the way someone is eating keeps insulin elevated all day, and if the way they are moving is minimal or unsustainable, then simply asking them to eat less is not enough. They are being asked to fight biology with arithmetic. Arithmetic matters, yes, but biology determines how difficult that arithmetic feels, how hungry it makes them, how much energy they have left, and how willing their body is to release the fat they already carry. A calmer and more accurate way to see the problem is this: the body is not refusing fat loss out of spite. It is following the dominant signals. If insulin remains elevated because of frequent eating, food choices that drive strong responses, poor sleep, inactivity, stress, or underlying resistance, then the body stays in a state that is always somewhat fed and not especially eager to burn stored fat. Change the signals, and the body can change its behavior. Not instantly, not dramatically every week, and not without consistency, but it can shift. That shift often begins not with severe restriction, but with stability. Better meal structure, more protein, more fibre, fewer refined carbohydrate floods, less snacking for the sake of emotional weather, more muscle use, more sleep, a little more time between eating occasions when appropriate. These changes lower the odds of insulin staying high all day. They allow the body to experience clearer fed states and clearer fasting states. And in those fasting states, the long-neglected ability to burn stored fat begins to return. Until then, though, many people live in a deeply confusing place. They are full in one sense, carrying more stored energy than they want, but never really burning in the way they need to. They spend their days riding small waves of insulin, hunger, and fatigue, wondering why fat loss feels so much harder than it sounds in diet books and motivational posts. The answer is not that they are uniquely flawed. It is that their body has been taught a pattern of fuel handling that keeps storage easy and access difficult. And when access becomes difficult enough, another problem often emerges alongside it. Hunger starts to feel louder than logic. Cravings begin to seem less like indulgence and more like necessity. A person who wants to lose fat may find themselves constantly drawn back toward food, not because they lack principles, but because the body's unstable fuel handling keeps creating the sensation of need. That is where the next part of the story begins, because once insulin remains high and fat access remains poor, appetite itself starts to become distorted. Hunger stops behaving like a simple signal of emptiness and becomes something more restless, more repetitive, and much harder to trust. Few things are more discouraging than trying to lose fat while feeling hungry all the time. Not ordinary hunger, not the calm and understandable kind that arrives before a meal and disappears afterward, but the restless kind. The kind that returns too quickly. The kind that makes food seem louder than your intentions. The kind that can leave you finishing a meal and somehow still scanning the kitchen, as though the body has filed a complaint and is waiting for additional support. When this happens often enough, people begin to think they simply have poor discipline, a greedy appetite, or some embarrassing lack of self-control that other, more respectable humans have somehow outgrown. But in many cases, what feels like weakness is really unstable fuel handling. The hunger is not imagined. The need feels real. It is just not always the kind of need the person assumes it is. This is where blood sugar swings and insulin patterns become especially important, because appetite is not just a matter of an empty stomach. It is the result of signals from the brain, gut, pancreas, liver, fat tissue, nervous system, and recent eating history, all trying to decide whether the body is secure, unstable, underfed, overfed, or somewhere in between. When those signals are steady, hunger tends to be easier to trust. It comes, it guides, it fades. But when blood sugar rises sharply and falls quickly, when insulin is repeatedly high, and when stored fat is not easily accessible, hunger can become distorted. Cravings can begin to feel like emergencies. Appetite becomes noisy. The body starts creating the illusion of need. To understand how this happens, it helps to begin with what hunger is supposed to do. Hunger is not the enemy. It is a signal meant to guide behavior in a helpful way. If you have gone long enough without food, or if your body senses that fuel availability is dropping, hunger encourages you to eat. In a metabolically flexible body, this works quite elegantly. A meal is eaten, nutrients are absorbed, blood sugar rises gently, insulin rises appropriately, energy is used and stored, satiety signals arrive, hunger fades. Hours later, as fuel from the meal is spent and insulin falls, the body begins to use stored energy. Hunger eventually returns at a sensible time, giving the person a chance to eat again. The system feels calm, and because it feels calm, it is much easier to make deliberate choices. Now compare that with a body caught in frequent glucose spikes and crashes. A person eats something quickly digested, perhaps sweet, refined or low in protein and fibre. Blood sugar rises fast. Insulin rises strongly to deal with that rise. Glucose is pushed into tissues. Blood sugar then falls. Sometimes it simply returns to normal, but because it rose so sharply, the fall can still feel dramatic. Other times it drops low enough to create real symptoms of shakiness, fatigue, irritability, or urgent hunger. The person feels they need something, and usually something quick. They do not crave grilled fish and lentils at that moment. They crave toast, sugar, cereal, crisps, biscuits, or anything that promises rapid relief and preferably some emotional comfort on the side. This is one of the crueler tricks of unstable blood sugar. The body produces a sensation that feels like deep need, but the need has been created partly by the previous meal. The person is not simply responding to a natural gap in eating. They are responding to a swing. The hunger is real, but it is amplified by the metabolic roller coaster. The illusion lies not in the feeling itself, but in what the feeling seems to mean. It feels like the body is empty or desperately underfed. In reality, the body may be well supplied with stored energy, but unable to access it smoothly because insulin is still relatively elevated, or because the person is insulin resistant and not shifting effectively into fat use. This is where cravings enter the story. Cravings are often treated as psychological weakness or indulgence. But many cravings have a physiological backdrop. A rapidly changing blood sugar level can alter brain function, mood, attention, and reward sensitivity. The brain likes reliable fuel. It is not fond of uncertainty, and when blood sugar is swinging, the brain becomes highly interested in something that will fix the problem quickly. Quick carbohydrates become very appealing. Foods high in both fat and refined carbohydrates become even more appealing because they offer both rapid fuel and strong reward. This is not because the brain is silly, it is because the brain is trying to solve what it perceives as an immediate fuel problem using the fastest tools available. People often notice this as a pattern of being good until the afternoon or evening, then suddenly wanting everything in sight. They may have eaten in a way that produced unstable energy all day. Breakfast may have been too light, too sweet, or too refined. Lunch may have been quick and low in satiety. Stress may have added more pressure. By late afternoon, the body is no longer making polite suggestions, it is making demands. The person feels a craving that seems larger than reason. They may promise themselves just one small treat, then find that one treat creates the desire for 3 more. This is not always because the first bite opened a moral black hole. It is often because the body had already been building toward a state of unstable need. Insulin plays a central role in this. When insulin rises often and stays high, the body is less able to release stored fat between meals. So instead of moving smoothly from meal fuel to body fuel, the person becomes more dependent on the next incoming source of energy. They become more snack reliant, more vulnerable to blood sugar dips, and more likely to interpret ordinary fatigue or emotional stress as a need to eat. The body is not drawing as effectively from reserves, so fresh fuel feels unusually necessary. This is why a person with insulin resistance can feel hungry much sooner than someone with better metabolic flexibility, even if both are carrying similar fat stores. There is also the matter of satiety hormones and how food composition affects them. Protein generally supports fullness well. Fiber slows digestion and adds volume. Meals with more protein, more fiber, and more intact food structure tend to produce steadier blood sugar and more durable satiety. By contrast, ultra-processed foods, liquid calories, refined carbohydrates, and foods designed to be rapidly eaten can create a strange paradox. They are calorie-dense but not especially satisfying. They produce energy but not much peace. The person eats a lot, yet the body does not feel secure for long. This insecurity shows up as repeated hunger. This is why 2 meals with the same calories can lead to wildly different evenings. A protein-rich meal with vegetables, some healthy fat, and slow-digesting carbohydrate may leave someone comfortably full for hours. A meal built from refined bread, sweet sauces, low protein and little fiber may deliver the same calories yet leave the person scanning cupboards not long afterward. The calorie count does not tell you how calm or chaotic the hormonal response will be. Satiety is not arithmetic. It is chemistry, digestion speed, nervous system response, and the brain's interpretation of all of it. The brain's reward system also becomes more involved when blood sugar is unstable. Food, especially highly palatable food, activates dopamine pathways related to motivation and reward. This is not inherently bad. Food is supposed to be rewarding, otherwise our species might not have been very motivated to survive. The problem is that in a modern environment filled with cheap, engineered, hyper-palatable food, the reward system is stimulated in ways it was never designed to handle regularly. Add fluctuating blood sugar and high insulin to that environment, and cravings become much stronger. The person is not just hungry. They are pulled toward foods that will soothe the metabolic swing and light up the reward circuits. It is a powerful combination. Then there is sleep. Poor sleep alters appetite profoundly. Ghrelin, which helps drive hunger, tends to rise. Leptin, which helps signal energy sufficiency, tends to fall. Insulin sensitivity worsens. Cravings for quick energy increase. A tired brain also becomes less interested in long-term goals and more interested in immediate relief. This is one reason a person who can confidently refuse biscuits in the morning can find themselves in negotiations with a chocolate bar at 10 p.m. after a bad night. The biology of sleep loss makes restraint harder and cravings louder. Again, this is not a character flaw, it is physiology under strain. Stress produces similar distortions. Chronic stress can raise cortisol, which influences blood sugar and appetite. Some people lose their appetite under acute stress, but chronic stress more often pushes people toward rewarding, calorie-dense foods. Stress also changes perception. A craving in a calm body may feel like a passing suggestion. The same craving in a stressed body can feel like a need with legal authority. Food becomes not only fuel, but relief, reward, distraction, sedation, and comfort. When blood sugar is unstable underneath all that, it becomes even harder to tell where physical hunger ends and stress-driven appetite begins. This is why the phrase, "just listen to your body," can be unintentionally unhelpful for people with insulin resistance and unstable appetite. If the body is sending distorted signals, listening is not simple. The person may genuinely feel hungry every few hours, they may crave sugar intensely, they may feel weak or irritable if they do not eat. Those signals are real, but they are not always accurate reflections of true energy need. They are often reflections of unstable access. The body has fuel, but not easy access to it, so it keeps requesting more. The illusion of need is born from this mismatch. It can be useful to distinguish between true biological hunger and what might be called fuel panic. True hunger tends to build gradually. It is patient. It often allows for many foods to seem appealing. Fuel panic is sharper, more specific, and often more emotional. It wants something fast. It wants relief now. It is often accompanied by shakiness, irritability, urgency, or the sense that one cannot possibly wait another half hour. Fuel panic is not imaginary, but it is often a sign that blood sugar regulation and insulin dynamics are not calm. The body can also learn these patterns over time. If someone repeatedly responds to afternoon dips with sweet snacks, the brain begins to associate that time of day with expected reward and rapid relief. Cravings become partly conditioned. The body is not only responding to current chemistry, but anticipating a familiar rescue. This does not mean the craving is fake. It means biology and habit have teamed up, which is a formidable partnership. The clock hits a certain hour, stress rises, energy dips slightly, and the brain says, "Ah yes, now we have the thing." If the thing does not appear, it can feel as though something is deeply wrong with the universe. There is also the way fat tissue itself participates in appetite. Fat tissue is not inert padding. It is hormonally active. It sends signals such as leptin to the brain about energy stores. In theory, more fat tissue should mean more leptin and less hunger. But in many people with excess body fat, especially long-standing excess body fat, the brain becomes less responsive to leptin. This is often described as leptin resistance. So the signal that should say we have enough stored energy becomes less effective. Now add insulin resistance, unstable blood sugar, poor sleep, and highly palatable food, and you have a body carrying plenty of energy, but behaving as though scarcity is always just around the corner. This is why fat loss can feel so psychologically punishing. The person is asked to eat less in a body that already feels as though it never quite has enough accessible energy. Hunger is not calm. Cravings are not occasional. Appetite does not politely step aside for their long-term goals. It presses and presses, often strongest at the exact moments when discipline is lowest, because the person is tired, stressed, or lonely. Then, when they eventually eat more than planned, they feel guilty and conclude that they sabotaged themselves. In many cases, they were not sabotaging themselves so much as finally giving in to a body that had been escalating its requests all day. This does not mean every craving must be obeyed, or that biology removes all responsibility. It means effective change has to address the physiology, not just the behavior. A person who is constantly riding blood sugar swings will usually do better by creating steadier meals than by trying to white-knuckle through the swings. A person who is under-eating protein, sleeping poorly, and grazing on refined carbohydrates all day does not need more shame. They need more stability, more fullness, more calm. A body that feels secure becomes easier to guide. One of the most powerful ways to reduce endless hunger is to build meals that digest more slowly and signal satiety more effectively. Protein is especially useful here because it supports fullness, preserves muscle, and generally creates a steadier metabolic response than refined carbohydrates alone. Fiber adds volume and slows digestion. Whole foods often require more chewing, more digestion, and more time for satiety signals to develop. Balanced meals reduce the sharp spikes and drops that create apparent need. They do not remove appetite, nor should they, but they make it more trustworthy. Spacing meals in a sensible way can help as well. Constant grazing keeps insulin stimulated and often prevents the body from ever fully shifting into a lower insulin state. For some people, fewer but more satisfying meals create calmer hunger and better fat access. This is not because there is magic in a particular meal schedule. It is because the body is being allowed to finish one fuel handling phase before starting the next. The difference can be dramatic. A person who once needed a snack every 2 hours may find, with better meal composition and more stable blood sugar, that they can go much longer comfortably. Movement also helps, not only because it burns calories, but because it improves fuel handling. A walk after meals can lower blood sugar, reduce the insulin burden, and improve how the body uses incoming fuel. Resistance training improves insulin sensitivity and helps create a stronger sink for glucose in muscle tissue. Better muscle function often means fewer blood sugar swings and calmer appetite. The person experiences this as fewer cravings, more stable energy, and less dramatic dependence on quick fixes. Sleep, again, is difficult to overstate. Many appetite problems are quietly sleep problems. A well-rested body is simply easier to feed appropriately. Hunger signals are steadier. Cravings are less tyrannical. Insulin sensitivity is better. Decision-making improves. The person is not spending the day trying to patch over exhaustion with sugar and caffeine. In a tired body, food often becomes a stimulant, a comforter, and a coping tool all at once. In a rested body, it can go back to being mostly food. Stress management matters for similar reasons. Reducing chronic stress does not eliminate cravings, but it makes them less loaded. The body no longer treats every afternoon slump as a minor emergency. Emotional eating often decreases when the nervous system is not constantly leaning toward alarm. A calmer nervous system usually means calmer appetite, which in turn makes fat loss far more realistic. Understanding the illusion of need can also reduce self-blame. If a craving arrives and feels overwhelming, that does not automatically mean the person is weak. It may mean their previous meal was poorly structured. It may mean they slept badly. It may mean they are insulin resistant, stressed, and riding a blood sugar drop. It may mean the body has been denied access to its own stored energy and is loudly asking for fresh fuel. Once you know that, the craving becomes information rather than proof of failure. This perspective matters because shame rarely improves appetite regulation. Shame makes people more stressed, more secretive about food, more extreme in their next diet attempt, and more likely to repeat the same cycle. Curiosity is more useful. Why was I so hungry then? What did I eat earlier? How much protein did I have? How did I sleep? Am I always craving sweet things after a rushed lunch? Questions like these help reveal the pattern. The body is usually following a pattern, even when it feels irrational, and there is almost always a pattern in people who feel endless hunger. Breakfast that is too small or too sugary, lunch that is rushed and unsatisfying, long periods of sedentary stress, too much caffeine standing in for nourishment, not enough protein, ultra-processed snacks that briefly relieve and then worsen the problem, poor sleep, late-night grazing. The body adapts to this rhythm and begins to expect repeated incoming energy because it is not getting steady access to energy in a better way. That expectation becomes appetite. Appetite becomes craving. Craving becomes self-judgment. Self-judgment becomes another source of stress. And the cycle goes on. The good news is that the cycle can be interrupted, not by perfection, not by fear, and not by treating every craving like an enemy, but by making the body feel metabolically safer. Safer meals, safer rhythms, safer energy. The body does not need to be bullied out of endless hunger. It needs fewer blood sugar swings, lower insulin strain, better satiety, better sleep, and more reliable access to fuel between meals. When that happens, appetite often changes in ways that feel almost miraculous, though they are really just physiological. A person who once thought about food all day may suddenly realize they forgot about snacks. A person who once felt desperate by late afternoon may feel perfectly normal until dinner. The illusion of constant need starts to fade because real metabolic stability is taking its place. And once you begin to see how much hunger is shaped by modern food patterns, another part of the story becomes impossible to ignore. This is not just about personal weakness or individual choice. Many of the foods and habits that keep insulin high and appetite unstable are built into ordinary modern life. The snacking, the speed, the refinement, the constant access, the processed convenience of it all. The body is not merely responding to isolated meals. It is responding to a whole environment that keeps nudging it back towards spikes, cravings, and repeated insulin release. That environment matters enormously because the modern pattern itself is often what keeps the whole system running in circles. There is a quiet pattern running through modern life that most people barely notice until something starts to feel off. It is not a single habit or a single food. It is a rhythm, a background way of eating and living that has become so normal it rarely gets questioned. Food is available almost everywhere, almost all the time. It is easy to eat quickly, easy to eat often, and easy to eat things that require very little effort from the body to digest. At first, this feels convenient, even helpful. But over time, this pattern changes the way the body handles energy, the way insulin behaves, and the way hunger shows up. It turns a flexible system into one that is constantly being nudged towards storage, repeated insulin release, and unstable appetite. To understand this pattern, it helps to look at how different it is from what human metabolism was built around. For most of human history, meals were separated by time and effort. Food had to be gathered, hunted, prepared, or at least obtained with some difficulty. There were natural pauses between eating occasions. The body had time to process one meal, allow insulin to rise and fall, and then shift into a state where stored energy could be used. Hunger was not always immediately satisfied. There was space for the body to move between fed and fasting states. Now compare that with a typical modern day. Breakfast may be something quick, often processed, eaten in a rush or even while standing. Coffee follows, sometimes with sugar or flavoured syrups. Mid-morning, there is a snack because energy dips, or because food is simply available. Lunch may be eaten quickly, often built from refined carbohydrates, low in protein, and designed more for convenience than for satiety. Afternoon brings another dip, another snack, perhaps something sweet to keep going. Dinner arrives, sometimes balanced, sometimes not. Then, as the evening settles in, food appears again, not out of hunger so much as habit, comfort, or routine. By the end of the day, the body has been asked to handle incoming energy repeatedly, with very little time in between to settle, reset, or access stored fuel. Each of these eating moments may seem small on its own. A biscuit here, a handful of crisps there, a drink with sugar, a quick sandwich. None of them feels like a major event, but metabolically, each one triggers a response. Blood sugar rises, insulin rises. The body shifts into a state that favours handling incoming fuel and suppressing fat release. When this happens once or twice, it is part of normal life. When it happens every couple of hours, day after day, the body begins to live in a near constant fed state. This is where the idea of constant insulin spikes becomes important. Insulin is not harmful in itself. It is necessary. It rises when you eat and falls afterward. But when eating is frequent and dominated by foods that digest quickly, insulin is stimulated again and again without much time to return to a lower baseline. The spikes may not even feel dramatic. In many people, especially those who are already insulin resistant, insulin may simply remain elevated most of the day rather than spiking sharply and falling completely. The result is the same. The body spends less time in the state where stored fat can be easily accessed. Processed foods play a central role in this pattern. Modern food processing has made it possible to create products that are highly palatable, easy to eat, and quick to digest. Refining grains removes fiber and structure, turning foods into forms that are absorbed rapidly. Sugars are added in ways that deliver quick energy and strong taste. Textures are softened. Chewing is reduced. Portions are often larger than necessary, and combinations of fat, sugar, and salt are carefully engineered to make foods difficult to stop eating. From the body's perspective, these foods are very different from their whole food counterparts. They tend to raise blood sugar more quickly and stimulate a stronger insulin response. They also tend to provide less satiety relative to their calorie content. This means a person can consume a significant amount of energy without feeling particularly full, and then feel hungry again sooner than expected. The body's not confused. It is responding to the rapid rise and fall of nutrients and the lack of sustained signals that a substantial, balanced meal has been consumed. Another important feature of processed foods is that they often bypass the slower, more deliberate stages of eating. Foods that require chewing, digestion, and time create a different hormonal environment than foods that are soft, liquid, or quickly consumed. A meal that takes time to eat allows satiety signals to develop while the person is still eating. A meal that disappears in minutes may be finished before the body has had a chance to register fullness. This leads to overeating not because of greed, but because of timing. The feedback system is simply slower than the rate of intake. Snacking amplifies this effect. The idea of snacking has become normalized to the point where many people feel uneasy going more than a couple of hours without eating. Snacks are marketed as necessary, helpful, even healthy in some cases. But from a metabolic perspective, frequent snacking means frequent insulin stimulation. Each snack, even a small one, can keep the body in a fed state. If snacks are primarily refined carbohydrates or sugary foods, they are even more likely to create blood sugar swings and repeated insulin release. This does not mean all snacking is inherently harmful. A well-structured snack with protein and fiber can fit into a healthy pattern. But the common modern version of snacking, quick, processed, carbohydrate-heavy, often eaten in response to boredom or mild fatigue, tends to keep the body in a cycle of constant fuel handling. The body rarely gets a chance to settle into a lower insulin state where fat can be released and used. There is also the issue of liquid calories. Sugary drinks, juices, flavoured coffees, and even some smoothies can deliver significant amounts of carbohydrate in a form that is absorbed very quickly. Because they are liquid, they often produce less satiety than solid food. The person may consume a large number of calories without feeling particularly full, and then eat a normal meal on top of that. Meanwhile, insulin is responding to each intake, and the body is repeatedly pushed towards storage. Caffeine complicates the picture further. It is often used to manage fatigue, especially in a lifestyle where sleep is not ideal. Coffee itself is not necessarily a problem, but when it is combined with sugar, syrups, and frequent consumption throughout the day, it becomes another source of repeated insulin stimulation. Caffeine can also mask hunger temporarily, leading people to delay eating in the morning and then overeat later when the effect wears off. This creates a pattern of underfueling and overcompensating, which is not stable for blood sugar or appetite. The pace of modern life also plays a role. Meals are often rushed, eaten while working, driving, or scrolling through a screen. This reduces awareness of satiety signals and can lead to overeating. It also disconnects eating from the body's natural rhythms. When meals are eaten quickly and without attention, the body's feedback systems are less effective. Hunger and fullness become harder to interpret, and eating becomes more reactive. Stress is woven into this pattern as well. Chronic stress increases cortisol, which can raise blood sugar and influence insulin. It also increases the appeal of quick, rewarding foods. When someone is stressed, tired, and surrounded by easily accessible processed food, the likelihood of frequent snacking and unstable eating patterns increases. This is not a failure of character. It is a predictable response to an environment that encourages it. Sleep, again, is a critical factor. Poor sleep increases hunger, especially for carbohydrate-rich foods. It reduces insulin sensitivity and makes blood sugar hard to manage. A sleep-deprived person is more likely to snack, more likely to crave quick energy, and less likely to make deliberate food choices. This reinforces the cycle of constant insulin stimulation. All of these elements come together to create what might be called the modern metabolic pattern. Frequent eating, processed foods, rapid digestion, repeated insulin release, limited time in a low insulin state, unstable blood sugar, persistent hunger, reduced access to stored fat. It is not one thing, it is the combination. This pattern is so common that it often feels normal. A person may not realize that eating every 2 hours, feeling tired in the afternoon, craving sweets in the evening, and struggling to lose fat are all connected. They may think each issue is separate. In reality, they are different expressions of the same underlying pattern. One of the most important insights here is that the body is responding logically to the signals it is given. If food arrives frequently, the body stays in a fed state. If insulin is stimulated repeatedly, fat release is suppressed repeatedly. If blood sugar rises and falls quickly, hunger and cravings follow. The body is not malfunctioning, it is following the pattern. This is why simply reducing calories without changing the pattern often leads to frustration. A person may eat smaller portions but still snack frequently, still rely on processed foods, still experience blood sugar swings, and still keep insulin elevated much of the day. Hunger remains high, energy remains unstable, and fat loss is slow. The person concludes that they need to try harder, when in fact they may need to change the structure of their eating. Changing the pattern does not require extreme measures. It often begins with simple shifts: fewer eating occasions, more substantial meals, more protein and fiber, less reliance on refined carbohydrates and sugary drinks, more whole foods that digest slowly and provide sustained energy, more awareness of how meals affect hunger later in the day. These changes reduce the frequency and intensity of insulin spikes and allow the body more time in a state where stored fat can be accessed. Movement also helps break the pattern. Even light activity after meals can improve glucose handling and reduce the insulin burden. Regular exercise improves insulin sensitivity and creates a greater demand for energy. This shifts the body away from constant storage and toward more balanced fuel use. Sleep and stress management are equally important. Better sleep improves insulin sensitivity and appetite regulation. Lower stress reduces the drive for frequent snacking and stabilizes hormonal signals. These changes support the body's ability to move out of the constant fed state. It is also helpful to recognize that the modern pattern is not entirely under individual control. The environment is designed in a way that makes frequent eating and processed food consumption easy. Food is available everywhere. Marketing encourages constant consumption. Social norms support snacking. Work schedules and stress make it difficult to eat slowly and deliberately. Understanding this helps reduce self-blame and allows for more realistic, sustainable changes. The goal is not to eliminate all enjoyment or to return to some imagined perfect past. It is to create a pattern that allows the body to function as it was designed to. Periods of eating followed by periods of not eating meals that provide sustained energy, insulin that rises and falls appropriately, hunger that is clear and manageable, fat that can be accessed when needed. When this pattern is restored, even partially, many of the problems associated with constant insulin spikes begin to ease. Hunger becomes less relentless, energy becomes more stable, cravings lose some of their urgency, fat loss becomes more achievable because the body is no longer being kept in a near constant storage mode. This does not happen overnight, and it does not require perfection. The body is adaptable. It responds to trends rather than isolated events. Small, consistent changes in eating patterns, food choices, movement, sleep, and stress can gradually shift the hormonal environment. Insulin becomes less constantly elevated. The body spends more time in a state where stored energy can be used. Appetite becomes easier to manage. And once you begin to see how much of the struggle comes from the pattern itself, another realization starts to emerge. It is not just about what you eat or how often you eat. It is about how the body interprets those choices. Calories are part of the story, but they do not tell the whole story. The way those calories are processed, the hormonal signals they create, and the patterns they form over time all shape the outcome. This is where the idea that calories alone explain fat loss begins to feel incomplete, because the body is not simply counting energy, it is responding to it in ways that are influenced by much more than just the number on a label. There is a certain kind of advice that sounds reassuring because it is so clean. Fat loss, it says, is simply about calories. Eat fewer than you burn, and the body must use stored fat. The logic is tidy, the math is neat, and the statement is not entirely wrong. Energy cannot be stored from nowhere. A body does obey the laws of physics, however dramatically it may sometimes behave around biscuits. And yet, when people try to apply this clean idea to messy real life, they often discover that something is missing. They reduce calories, sometimes quite seriously, and still find themselves hungry, tired, stalled, or rebounding. They count carefully, they plan nobly, they buy smaller plates and foods with words like light and guilt-free on the packaging, and still the body does not respond as simply as the equation promised. That is when confusion begins. The confusion is not because calories do not matter, they do. The confusion is because the body does not experience calories as abstract numbers. It experiences meals, hormones, digestion speed, blood sugar changes, appetite shifts, stress, sleep, movement and metabolic signals. It experiences context. 2 meals can contain the same calories and produce very different effects in the body. 2 people can eat the same number of calories and have very different hunger, energy and fat loss responses. The body is not ignoring the calorie total. It is interpreting that total through a hormonal and physiological lens. And that lens changes everything about how easy or difficult fat loss feels. One reason calories alone do not tell the whole story is that the body does not simply receive energy and then calmly subtract what it used. It responds dynamically. If energy intake drops, hormones change, appetite may rise, movement may decrease without the person even noticing. Body temperature may shift slightly. Resting energy expenditure can adapt. The body is not a static furnace. It is a living system trying to protect itself from both excess and shortage. When food intake changes, the body changes too. This is why 2 calorie deficits on paper can feel completely different in practice. One person may reduce calories in a way that keeps blood sugar stable, improves satiety, and lowers insulin demand. They feel reasonably full, their energy stays decent, and fat loss happens with tolerable discomfort. Another person may reduce calories while still eating foods that spike and crash blood sugar, leave them hungry quickly, and keep insulin elevated much of the day. On paper, the calorie intake may look similar. In the body, the experience is entirely different. One deficit is manageable, the other feels like punishment. Food composition matters enormously here. Consider 2 lunches with the same calories. One is built around protein, fiber, and minimally processed foods, perhaps chicken, lentils, vegetables, olive oil, and fruit. The other is built around refined bread, crisps, a sweetened drink, and a small dessert. The calorie total may match, but the hormonal consequences do not. The first meal digests more slowly, supports satiety, produces a steadier blood sugar response, and may require less dramatic insulin handling. The second may digest quickly, raise blood sugar sharply, stimulate a stronger insulin response, and leave the person hungry again much sooner. Calories matter in both cases, but they do not predict the body's experience of that meal very well. This is one of the reasons people become frustrated with calorie counting. They are told that a calorie is a calorie, which is true in a strict energy sense, but not especially useful in a biological sense. A calorie from protein comes with a different thermic effect, satiety profile, and hormonal response than a calorie from refined sugar. A calorie eaten in a whole food matrix behaves differently from a calorie delivered in a liquid form. A calorie consumed after a full night's sleep may be handled differently from one consumed after chronic sleep deprivation. The body does not tear the label off and process the number, it processes the food. Protein is a good example. Protein generally increases satiety more than carbohydrates or fat. It has a higher thermic effect, meaning the body uses more energy digesting and processing it. It helps preserve muscle mass during fat loss, which matters because muscle supports metabolic health and glucose disposal. Two diets with the same calories but very different protein levels can lead to very different outcomes in hunger, body composition, and energy. So even when calories are matched, the body's not experiencing the same thing. Fiber is another example. Fiber slows digestion, reduces the speed of glucose absorption, feeds the gut microbiome, and increases fullness. A high-fiber diet and a low-fiber diet may look similar in calories, but they can produce very different insulin responses, blood sugar patterns, and hunger signals. A person eating low-fiber processed foods may find themselves far hungrier than someone eating the same calorie total with more intact fiber-rich foods. Again, the calories are not irrelevant, they are simply not the full story. Then there is the issue of insulin and fuel access. A person can reduce calories but still keep insulin elevated with frequent eating and processed carbohydrates. In that situation, stored fat may remain less accessible, hunger may remain high, and the body may struggle to shift into a comfortable fat-burning state. Another person may reduce calories in a way that allows insulin to rise and fall more appropriately, improves sensitivity, and creates longer stretches of lower insulin between meals. Same idea of a calorie deficit, very different hormonal terrain. One body feels trapped and deprived. The other begins to access stored energy more smoothly. This is where the phrase, "the body's confusion," becomes useful, because what looks like confusion is often the body responding to mixed signals. Imagine the body receiving a reduced calorie intake, which might suggest that stored energy should be used, while also receiving repeated insulin spikes, unstable blood sugar, chronic stress, and poor sleep, all of which make the body behave as though fuel access is uncertain and threat is present. From the body's perspective, the signals are messy. It is being told there is less food overall, but also being pushed through repeated hormonal swings that make appetite louder and fat access harder. The result is a body that does not lose fat as efficiently as the neat calorie model would predict. There is also the question of how calorie deficits change energy expenditure. People often imagine that if they reduce intake by a certain amount, fat loss should proceed at a fixed rate. But the body adapts. Part of this adaptation is conscious. A person eating less may feel less energetic and choose to move less, but much of it is unconscious. Fidgeting may decrease, spontaneous movement may drop, exercise intensity may slip. The body becomes slightly more economical, using less energy for the same tasks. This is not failure, it is physiology. It is one reason long dieting periods often become less productive over time. Hormones participate in these adaptations, Leptin, which helps signal energy sufficiency, often falls with dieting and fat loss. Hunger rises, thyroid output can change, reproductive hormones can shift. Cortisol may increase if the dieting process is stressful enough. These are not side notes. They are part of why a body under prolonged energy restriction can become harder to lean out. Again, calories still matter, but the body is changing how it responds to those calories. This is also why the same calorie intake can be a deficit for one person and maintenance for another. Age, body size, sex, muscle mass, hormones, activity level, sleep, genetics, previous dieting history, medications and metabolic adaptation all influence energy expenditure. Two people eating the same number of calories are not necessarily receiving the same signal. For one person it may be plenty. For another, it may be a shortage. That shortage will then trigger its own set of biological responses. There is another problem with calorie-only thinking. It can make people ignore the quality of their food in favour of the quantity alone. If someone is told that only calories matter, they may choose highly processed, low-satiety foods as long as they fit the number. In the short term, this can produce some weight loss if intake truly drops. But it often comes at the cost of stronger hunger, poorer energy, worse blood sugar control, and less sustainable habits. The person may technically be following the math while physiologically making the process harder than it needs to be. This is one reason people sometimes say they can lose weight eating junk food if they keep calories low. That can be true for a while. The body can lose mass in an energy deficit even if food quality is poor. But whether that approach is comfortable, healthy, sustainable, or supportive of good body composition is another matter entirely. Losing weight while feeling terrible is still losing weight. It is just not a particularly elegant or durable strategy. And for people with insulin resistance or unstable appetite, it often collapses quickly because the body keeps demanding relief. It is also worth noticing that the body responds not only to how much is eaten, but to when and how often. Frequent small meals may work well for some people, but for others, especially those with high insulin and unstable appetite, they can keep the body in a constant state of fuel handling. Larger, more balanced meals spaced further apart may create more satiety and better insulin dynamics. The calorie total may be identical by the end of the day, but the hormonal experience differs. That experience shapes hunger, adherence, and fat access. Liquid calories are another place where calories alone mislead. A sweet drink may contain the same calories as a small snack, but it often produces less fullness and is consumed far more quickly. The body receives the energy without much chewing, without much slowing down, and without strong satiety. The person may then eat the same meal they would have eaten anyway. The calories count, certainly, but their effect on appetite and compensation is very different. This is one reason sugary drinks are so effective at increasing total intake without making people feel that they have eaten much. The body's interpretation of calories is also affected by the gut. Digestion is not just extraction, it is communication. The gut releases hormones that influence satiety, insulin secretion, gastric emptying, and appetite. The microbiome may influence some of these processes as well. Whole foods and processed foods send different gut signals. Chewing, volume, fibre, and food structure all affect how the gut reports the meal to the brain. A calorie from a crisp, airy snack and a calorie from beans or potatoes may not generate the same satiety message, even if both technically contribute energy. Then there is the emotional side of eating, which calorie-only models rarely capture. Stress, boredom, loneliness, habit, celebration, fatigue, and reward all influence intake. A person who is metabolically and emotionally strained may find a calorie deficit far harder to maintain than someone who is well rested and calm. This is not because emotions create energy from nowhere. It is because emotions shape behavior powerfully, and behavior determines whether the planned calorie intake is realistic. A diet that looks easy on paper may be unbearable in a stressed life. This is why some people rebound so quickly after a period of strict dieting. They managed to enforce a calorie deficit through sheer will, but hunger rose, satiety fell, energy dropped, stress increased, and the body adapted defensively. Once the person relaxes their control even slightly, appetite drives intake up rapidly. Weight returns. The person concludes that they failed. A more accurate explanation is that the body's regulatory systems were pushing hard in the other direction all along. Calories mattered, but so did the hormonal and behavioral forces shaping those calories. Insulin sits right in the middle of this complexity. It does not abolish the importance of energy balance, but it affects how easy energy balance is to achieve. High insulin can increase hunger indirectly, reduce access to stored fat, and encourage storage. Lowering insulin strain through better food choices, meal spacing, movement, and sleep can make a calorie deficit feel more natural rather than forced. In that sense, insulin is part of the story not because it breaks the rules of energy, but because it influences the body's willingness to cooperate with those rules. A helpful way to think about it is this. Calories tell you how much energy is present, but hormones tell the body what to do with that energy, and how urgent it feels to get more. Calories are quantity, hormones are instructions. You need both pieces to understand why fat loss is easy for some and exhausting for others. A person can have the same calorie target as someone else, and still struggle more because their hormonal instructions are less favourable. Their hunger is louder. Their energy is less stable. Their body is more resistant to releasing stored fat. The numbers alone do not show that. This is also why sustainable fat loss often begins to work better when people stop obsessing over the arithmetic alone and start improving the signals. More protein, more fibre, fewer ultra-processed foods, better meal structure, less grazing, more movement, especially walking and resistance training, better sleep, lower stress where possible. These changes may still reduce calories in the end, but they do so by making the body less confused. Hunger becomes clearer, satiety becomes more reliable, insulin becomes less constantly elevated, energy stabilizes. Now the deficit feels like cooperation rather than combat. There is a further irony here. People often think complexity is an excuse, as though admitting that calories are not the whole story somehow means nothing matters and metabolism is pure mystery. It is not mystery. It is just richer than a slogan. Energy balance still matters. But energy balance is produced by a body that is sensing, adapting, storing, releasing, resisting, compensating, and responding all day long. Ignoring that does not make the process simpler. It just makes the advice less useful. The body, then, is not really confused in the sense of being random. It is more accurate to say that it is trying to interpret a set of mixed messages. Processed food, but low calories. Frequent snacking, but an overall deficit. Chronic stress, but an expectation of easy fat loss. Poor sleep, but a desire for stable appetite. Less food overall, but high insulin much of the day. The body responds to the net pattern of those signals, and that response may not match the neat predictions of a calorie ledger. Once you see that, much of the frustration starts to make more sense. The person who did everything right may actually have done everything the calorie model suggested while leaving the hormonal environment unchanged. They reduced portions but kept the same grazing pattern. They chose low-calorie processed foods that kept them hungry. They exercised hard but slept badly and recovered poorly. They counted carefully but remained insulin-resistant and metabolically strained. The issue was never that calories did not matter. It was that the body needed more than arithmetic to feel safe enough to release fat consistently. And that realization opens the door to something more hopeful. If calories alone do not tell the whole story, then fat loss is not merely a contest of deprivation. It becomes a process of restoring the conditions under which the body handles energy well. Less confusion, better signals, more cooperation. A body that is not being constantly pushed into storage is far more willing to let go. Which brings us naturally to the next question. If the body can become trapped in a pattern of high insulin, unstable appetite, and confusing mixed signals, what actually helps calm that signal down? What changes make insulin less demanding, the body more responsive, and fat loss more possible without feeling like a full-time argument with hunger? There is a noticeable shift that happens when the body begins to feel calmer around food. Hunger becomes less urgent, energy becomes steadier, meals start to feel like they carry you forward rather than setting you up for another craving an hour later. Fat loss, when it happens, feels less like a battle and more like something the body is finally willing to allow. This shift does not come from forcing the body harder. It comes from changing the signals the body receives, especially the signals that keep insulin elevated and fuel handling unstable. Quieting insulin is not about eliminating it or fearing it. It is about restoring rhythm, reducing constant stimulation, and allowing the body to return to a state where it can move between storing and burning without confusion. The first and most important change often has nothing to do with restriction. It has to do with structure. A body that is constantly receiving small amounts of food, especially foods that raise blood sugar quickly, never gets a chance to settle. Insulin rises again and again, and even when it falls slightly, it may not fall far enough or long enough to allow fat to be accessed comfortably. Creating clearer meal boundaries can make a surprising difference. Instead of grazing through the day, meals become more defined. Food is eaten, insulin rises, the meal is processed, and then there is a period when no new fuel arrives. In that period, insulin can fall more fully, and the body can begin to draw from stored energy. This does not require rigid schedules or extreme fasting. It often begins simply with fewer eating occasions and more satisfying meals. When meals are substantial enough, with enough protein, fiber, and energy to genuinely satisfy, the need to snack diminishes. The body is not being deprived, it is being fed in a way that reduces the constant need for more. Over time, this creates longer stretches where insulin is lower, and those stretches are where fat becomes more accessible. Protein plays a central role here. It is one of the most effective nutrients for satiety. It supports muscle maintenance, which in turn improves insulin sensitivity. It slows the return of hunger and reduces the likelihood of overeating later. Meals that are low in protein often leave a gap that the body tries to fill with more food, usually quick energy foods that bring insulin right back up. Increasing protein does not eliminate insulin responses, but it often makes those responses more controlled and more useful. It also helps the body feel secure, which reduces the urgency of hunger. Fiber and whole foods are equally important. Foods that retain their natural structure digest more slowly, release glucose more gradually, and provide more sustained energy. Vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and minimally processed foods require more work from the body to break down, which spreads out the delivery of nutrients. This leads to a smoother rise in blood sugar and a more moderate insulin response. It also creates a sense of fullness that lasts longer, reducing the need for frequent eating. By contrast, refined and ultra-processed foods tend to do the opposite. They are absorbed quickly, create sharper rises in blood sugar, and often leave the body wanting more soon after. Reducing these foods does not mean eliminating all enjoyment, but it does mean recognizing how strongly they influence insulin and appetite. Even small shifts, choosing a more balanced meal instead of a quick processed option, can begin to change the pattern. Another powerful way to quiet insulin is through movement, especially around meals. When muscles contract, they can take up glucose independently of insulin. This means that even a short walk after eating can help lower blood sugar and reduce the amount of insulin needed to manage that meal. Over time, regular movement improves insulin sensitivity, making the body more responsive and reducing the need for high insulin levels. This does not require intense exercise. Consistent, moderate activity often has a stronger long-term effect than occasional extreme effort. Resistance training adds another layer. Building and maintaining muscle increases the body's capacity to store and use glucose effectively. Muscle acts as a metabolic ally. helping to clear glucose from the bloodstream and reducing the burden on insulin. A body with more active muscle tissue is generally more flexible in how it handles energy. It can move more easily between storing and burning, which is exactly what is needed for fat loss. Sleep is one of the most overlooked factors in insulin balance. A well-rested body handles glucose more effectively, produces a more appropriate insulin response, and regulates appetite more reliably. Poor sleep, even for a few nights, can increase hunger, reduce insulin sensitivity, and make cravings stronger. Over time, chronic sleep deprivation creates a metabolic environment that favors storage and instability. Improving sleep is not always simple, but even small improvements, consistent bedtime, reduced screen exposure, a darker and quieter sleep environment can begin to shift the body toward better balance. Stress reduction works in a similar way. Chronic stress keeps cortisol elevated, which can raise blood sugar and increase the demand for insulin. It also drives emotional eating and cravings for quick, rewarding foods. Lowering stress does not require eliminating all pressure from life, which would be unrealistic, but it does involve creating moments of calm and recovery. This might be as simple as walking, breathing exercises, time away from screens, or activities that allow the nervous system to settle. A calmer body is more metabolically stable. Hydration also plays a small but useful role. Mild dehydration can sometimes be mistaken for hunger, and proper hydration supports overall metabolic function. While it is not a primary driver of insulin, it contributes to the general environment in which the body operates. There is also the matter of consistency. The body responds to patterns more than isolated events. A single balanced meal will not transform insulin sensitivity, just as a single indulgent meal will not destroy it. What matters is what happens most of the time. When meals are consistently structured in a way that supports stability, when movement is regular, when sleep is prioritized, and when stress is managed as well as possible, the body begins to adapt. Insulin becomes less constantly elevated. Cells become more responsive. Hunger becomes easier to interpret. Fat loss becomes more achievable. It is important to approach this with patience. Insulin resistance and metabolic imbalance develop over time, and they do not disappear overnight. The body needs repeated signals of stability before it begins to trust that it can release stored energy more freely. Early changes may be subtle. Hunger may feel slightly less urgent. Energy may become a bit more even. Cravings may lose some of their intensity. These are signs that the system is beginning to settle. There is also a psychological shift that often accompanies this process. When the body feels more stable, the need to constantly think about food decreases. Decisions become easier. The person is no longer negotiating with hunger every hour. This reduces stress and creates a more sustainable relationship with eating. Instead of trying to control the body through force, the person begins to work with it. It is worth noting that extreme approaches are not always the most effective way to quiet insulin. Severe restriction, prolonged fasting without preparation, or highly rigid diets can sometimes create additional stress and instability. While some structured fasting approaches can be helpful when done appropriately, they are not necessary for everyone and can backfire if they increase hunger and stress. The goal is not to shock the system, but to calm it. Balance is the key idea. Not balance in the sense of perfection, but in the sense of a pattern that allows the body to function as it was designed to. Periods of eating followed by periods of not eating. Meals that satisfy rather than stimulate endless appetite. Movement that supports metabolic health. Sleep that restores. Stress that is managed rather than constant. In this environment, insulin can do its job without dominating the entire day. One of the most encouraging aspects of this process is that small changes can have meaningful effects. A person does not need to transform everything at once. Improving breakfast composition, adding a short walk after meals, increasing protein, reducing sugary drinks, going to bed slightly earlier. Each of these shifts contributes to a quieter metabolic signal. Over time, these changes accumulate. The body becomes less reactive, less driven by swings, and more capable of accessing stored energy. There is also a sense of relief that often comes with understanding this. The struggle with fat loss is no longer seen as a personal failure, but as a mismatch between the body's signals and the environment. Once that mismatch is addressed, the body can begin to respond differently. Hunger becomes more manageable, energy becomes more reliable. Fat loss, when it happens, feels less like something being forced and more like something being allowed. This does not mean the process is effortless. It still requires attention, consistency, and patience, but it becomes more predictable and less punishing. The person is no longer fighting constant cravings or unstable energy. They are working within a system that supports their goals, and as this balance returns, another realization begins to take shape. Fat loss is not simply about removing something from the body, it's about restoring a pattern that allows the body to use what it already has. When insulin is quieter, when the signals are clearer, and when the body feels secure, it can finally begin to let go. Not because it has been forced, but because it no longer needs to hold on so tightly. That realization leads naturally to a final reflection, because once you see how much of fat loss is shaped by signals rather than willpower alone, the question becomes less about what you should be doing differently and more about how you understand the process itself. What does it mean if fat loss is not simply a matter of trying harder, but of creating the conditions in which the body is willing to change? There is a particular kind of sadness that can settle around the subject of fat loss, especially for people who have tried many times and come away feeling as though the only reasonable conclusion is that they simply were not strong enough. They may not say it aloud. They may joke about their sweet tooth, their lack of discipline, their evening cravings, their inability to stick to anything. But beneath the humour there is often a quieter belief, one that hurts more than any number on a scale. The belief is that if they were more controlled, more organised, more determined, more like the people who seem to find all this easy, then their body would finally cooperate. And when the body does not cooperate, that belief hardens. It becomes a private verdict. I must not be trying hard enough. I must be the problem. But if you have followed this long, gentle trail through insulin, blood sugar, hunger, storage, resistance, and the modern pattern of eating, then perhaps by now another possibility has begun to appear. Perhaps the body was never asking to be bullied. Perhaps it was never failing a moral test at all. Perhaps fat loss is not mainly a matter of heroic willpower, but of biology, signals, rhythms, conditions, and trust. Not trust in the dreamy self-help sense, but trust in the deeply practical sense of a body deciding whether it is safe to release what it has stored. This matters because willpower is a poor long-term strategy against a body that believes it is under metabolic pressure. You can override hunger for a while. You can ignore cravings for a while. You can out-stubborn a few difficult evenings and perhaps even a few difficult weeks. Human beings are remarkably capable of short bursts of grim determination. But if the body remains insulin resistant, if blood sugar stays unstable, if meals keep producing strong spikes and crashes, if sleep is poor, if stress is high, if food is both comfort and fuel and relief and reward, then willpower is being asked to stand in front of a much larger machine and hold it back with its bare hands. Sometimes it manages. Often it does not. And when it fails, people blame their character for what was, in many cases, a predictable collision between intention and physiology. So if fat loss is not just willpower, what is it really? It is partly information. The body is always gathering information. Every meal tells it something. Every long stretch without food tells it something. Every walk after dinner, every restless night, every stressful week, every phase of steady eating or chaotic grazing is interpreted as data. The body does not know your aesthetic goals, your old photographs, your frustration with the mirror, or your desire to fit into a particular pair of jeans without having to perform a small lung exercise first. It knows patterns, it knows signals, It knows whether incoming fuel is frequent or occasional, whether blood sugar is stable or swinging, whether insulin is constantly elevated or allowed to settle, whether muscle is being used, whether recovery is happening, whether the environment feels safe enough to spend or uncertain enough to save. In that sense, fat loss is not about convincing the body with arguments. It is about changing the information it receives often enough that it begins to behave differently. It is also partly access. This may be one of the most important ideas of all. Many people think of body fat simply as excess, as something sitting there waiting to be removed if only they can eat little enough. But body fat is stored energy, and stored energy matters only if it can be accessed. A person can carry a great deal of stored fuel and still feel hungry, tired, and driven to eat if insulin remains too high for that fuel to be released easily. This is the great metabolic irony. The body can be full in one sense and underpowered in another. Fat loss, then, is not only about having fat, it is about whether the body can comfortably use it. When insulin is high much of the day, when fat release is repeatedly suppressed, and when the body has become less flexible about shifting from meal fuel to stored fuel, fat loss becomes harder, not because the laws of energy have stopped working, but because the route to the stored energy is partially blocked. If that blockage improves, if insulin becomes quieter and sensitivity better, then access improves. Hunger often softens, energy steadies. The body becomes more willing to draw from what it already has. That is not a trick. It is not a loophole. It is metabolism beginning to work with you rather than against you. Fat loss is also partly appetite regulation. This is where so much unnecessary shame enters the story. People imagine that hunger should be simple and that cravings are embarrassing, childish things. But hunger is not simple at all. It is shaped by insulin, blood sugar, protein intake, fiber, sleep, stress, food reward, habits, memories, and the brain's predictions about what relief usually comes next. A person with stable appetite is not merely more virtuous than a person with unstable appetite. Often they are living in a different hormonal experience. Food may occupy less mental space for them because their body is not constantly generating fuel panic. Their blood sugar may be steadier, their meals may satisfy more deeply, their stored energy may be more accessible, they are not facing the same internal noise. This is why telling someone to rely on willpower alone can be so cruel without anyone meaning it to be. It assumes the appetite they are resisting is a straightforward desire rather than a biologically amplified signal. It assumes every craving is roughly equal in force and every body equally easy to regulate. That is simply not true. Fat loss becomes much more realistic when appetite is calmed, not merely suppressed. And appetite is calmed when the body feels reliably fed, metabolically stable, and less trapped in blood sugar swings and repeated insulin spikes. It is also partly environment. Human bodies do not operate in laboratories. They operate in kitchens, cars, offices, shops, family routines, emotional habits, social expectations, and tired evenings. They operate in a world where food is hyper-palatable, available constantly, and often designed to override natural stopping points. They operate in a world where sleep is shortened, stress is chronic, movement is optional, and eating is frequently rushed. In such an environment, a body that stores readily and craves quick energy is not malfunctioning. It is adapting, however unhelpfully, to the conditions around it. So fat loss is not simply a personal project. It is also an environmental negotiation. It becomes easier when the environment changes a little. More protein in the house, fewer foods that disappear in 6 bites and leave no memory of having been eaten. Meals planned enough that hunger does not always meet panic. Walking built into ordinary life. Sleep treated as metabolic repair rather than a luxury for people with simpler schedules. These shifts may sound modest, but they matter because the body responds to repeated surroundings. It is always learning what kind of world it lives in. Fat loss is also partly identity, though not in the grand philosophical sense, more in the practical sense of what a person believes their body is and what kind of care it deserves. Many people approach fat loss from a place of resentment. The body is seen as disobedient, greedy, broken, embarrassing, or weak. Food becomes either reward or punishment. Exercise becomes either penance or proof of virtue. None of this creates a particularly cooperative relationship. A body treated like an enemy tends to be managed through force, and force has limits. But when someone begins to understand that their body has been trying, in its own clumsy protective way, to keep them safe under modern conditions, something softens. The body is no longer a saboteur, it is a system receiving signals. That does not make change automatic, but it makes change kinder and often more effective. Instead of asking, how do I punish this body into shrinking, the question becomes, what conditions help this body feel safe enough to stop storing so defensively? That is a different project entirely, and perhaps most importantly, fat loss is partly time. Modern culture loves fast results because fast results are glamorous, marketable, and emotionally satisfying. But the systems we have been discussing do not all change overnight. Insulin resistance may take years to develop. Appetite patterns may be reinforced daily for decades. Sleep deprivation, stress eating, blood sugar instability, and sedentary habits leave marks on metabolism that are not erased in a week of clean eating and noble intentions. The body usually changes through repeated evidence, not one grand gesture. It learns slowly that meals are now steadier, that hunger is less chaotic, that movement is more common, that nights are more restful, that not every dip in mood will be answered with sugar. Over time, the body starts to believe this new pattern. When it believes the pattern, it behaves differently. This is why patience is not just a character trait in fat loss, it is part of the mechanism. A person who panics after 10 days and swings into something harsher may actually interrupt the very adaptation they need. A person who stays with the quiet changes, the boring useful things, often gets the deeper result. Not always quickly, not always in a straight line, but more durably. The body begins to lower its guard because it is no longer being shouted at. There is also a very human truth hidden in all of this. People do not only eat because of biology, they eat because they are tired, lonely, celebrating, grieving, procrastinating, soothing themselves, joining others, remembering childhood, avoiding feelings, and making it through the evening. Food is not merely fuel, it is part of culture, comfort, habit, identity, and survival in the emotional sense as well. Any explanation of fat loss that ignores this will always be incomplete. If willpower were the whole story, then no one would ever eat for comfort, and no one would ever find themselves halfway through a packet of something wondering vaguely when exactly they stopped making decisions and started conducting research on the sound of crunching. But because food is more than fuel, fat loss must also be more than restriction. It must account for the fact that some forms of eating are doing emotional work. Sometimes the path forward is not only about changing the meal itself, but about changing the life around the meal. More rest, more support, less stress, more honest ways of tending to pain that do not require the kitchen to function as therapist, reward centre, and emergency department all at once. This too is part of metabolic health, because a nervous system that feels under siege will always make appetite and restraint more difficult. If one were to sum all of this up gently, it might sound like this. Fat loss is the body's willingness to release stored energy under conditions it interprets as safe, stable, and appropriate. That willingness depends on hormones, appetite, insulin sensitivity, blood sugar stability, movement, sleep, stress, food quality, and the larger rhythm of life. Willpower can support those changes, of course. It helps someone choose a different breakfast, go for the walk, close the kitchen, get to bed, keep going when progress is slow. But willpower is the assistant, not the engine. The engine is the body's response to repeated conditions. This realization can be oddly comforting. It means the person struggling is not necessarily lazy. It means repeated failure at harsh diets may not be proof of weakness, but proof that the method was fighting the body too directly. It means there is another way to understand stalls and regain an endless hunger, not as personal disgrace, but as useful evidence. The body is telling you something about its current state. High insulin, unstable fuel access, poor satiety, too much stress, not enough sleep, too much grazing, too little muscle use. The signals are there if one learns to read them. It also means success may need to be measured differently, at least at first. Before major visible fat loss, there may be quieter victories, waking less ravenous, going longer between meals comfortably, not needing the afternoon sugar rescue, feeling less obsessed with food, sleeping better, walking after dinner and actually enjoying the small change in mood and digestion, noticing that cravings now feel like suggestions rather than commands. These changes matter because they usually mean the underlying system is improving. The body is becoming easier to live in before it necessarily becomes dramatically different to look at. And that may be the most generous realization before sleep. Fat loss is not really a referendum on your virtue. It is not the final proof of whether you are disciplined enough to deserve ease or attractive enough to deserve peace. It is a biological process unfolding inside a human life, with all its messiness, all its patterns, all its real constraints. A body that holds fat is not immoral. A body that struggles to lose it is not failing on purpose. It may simply be protecting itself according to signals it has learned over time. When those signals change, the body can change too. Not instantly, not perfectly, not always dramatically, but often more reliably than people expect once they stop waging war and start restoring balance. So perhaps the gentlest answer to the question is this: if fat loss is not just willpower, then it is regulation. It is signal management. It is access. It is appetite. It is stability. It is the body deciding little by little that it no longer needs to hold on so tightly. It is not you proving your worth through hunger. It is your biology becoming flexible enough to trust release again. And maybe that is a kinder story to end with tonight. Not one where the body is an enemy to conquer, but one where it is a cautious keeper of energy, always listening, always adapting, sometimes overprotective, sometimes frustrating, but not malicious. A body that has been storing for reasons, a body that can learn new reasons, a body that, when given steadier meals, better sleep, more movement, calmer signals, and enough time, may slowly begin to loosen its grip. So if you have ever felt trapped in the belief that fat loss should be simple, and that your struggle proves something awful about you, let that thought rest a little now. Your body is more complicated than a slogan, more sensitive than a calorie tally, more responsive to patterns than to punishment. And somewhere beneath the hunger, the habits, the insulin, the stress, and the long history of trying, there is still a system capable of change, not through force alone, but through understanding, not through shame, but through steadier signals, not through endless self-criticism, but through a quieter kind of consistency. And as the day falls away and the body turns, as all bodies do, toward rest, it may be enough simply to remember this. You were never meant to win a war against yourself. You were meant to learn the language your body was speaking, and then answer it a little more wisely tomorrow.